In my presentation, we are going to discuss the methods and the results achieved within the Avenir Élevage study regarding how to quantify raw material flows used in animal feed in France and segmenting consumption by animal sector. Several partners were involved, people specializing in research, public administration, and representatives of the breeding industry and also the feed industry. When the work started in 2017, the background was that of society having greater expectations regarding animal feed. For instance, no GMOs, no imported deforestation, and an attempt to limit competition with human food. There is also an increased variability regarding raw material availability from one year to the next due to weather conditions. And we also had observed that the statistical system at the time did not allow us to have a large picture of the feed system and consumption of feed. Of animal feed. And also we felt the need to perform a strategic study regarding our national agricultural sovereignty, especially regarding proteins. The aim of the work was to update our references and come up with a method to answer the following question: which animal industry consumes which kind of feed? 17 concentrated vegetal industries were involved. As opposed to fodder, every time we included the byproducts that were generated at every stage of the processing. Fodder was also studied, and the main French industries were studied: ruminants, swine, poultry, rabbits, etc. The reference year was 2015 because it was the year for which we had the highest quantity of statistics at the time when we started the work. In order to be able to quantify the flow, the method initially focused on collecting a large quantity of input data from many sources: public statistics, interprofessional federations, customs, data provided by the technical institutes, Cereopa, and also data from expert research. All the data was heterogeneous, and sometimes there were even contradictions between the data. So we tried to reconcile the data by optimizing the data under stress or constraint based on Jean-Yves Courtonne's method in partnership with INRIA. And the method allowed us to make sure that the large quantity of data from multiple sources became consistent. And the point was that we were able to integrate uncertainty coefficients regarding the input data to be able to move away from the data depending on whether it was reliable or not. And the idea was to estimate the gaps for which we had no official statistics. Reconciliation was conducted in several stages. First of all, a detailed study of the vegetal industry, the plant industry, looking at all the various crops in France, exports, human food or animal feed, and trying to isolate the raw material that was available, the raw materials that were available for animal feeds. In the second stage of reconciliation, we looked at the raw materials that were crossed with the needs, cross-matched with the needs for each animal breeding industry. In an independent stage, we also looked at fodder. Here we have the visual and simplified representation of the results for all the flow. This is a so-called Sankey diagram, which starts from the resources segmentation of each breeding industry. And here we estimate the total quantity of raw materials used for animal feed, 34 million tons, and total consumption and fodder consumption was estimated at 70 to 70.5 million tons. This is consistent with other studies. We see that bovine cattle consumes 34% of the raw materials, and then we have poultry, 34% of the concentrated raw materials, followed by swine, 23% of the total raw materials. Now, let us focus on swine consumption. Reconciliation of the data allowed us to estimate the consumption for 2015, 7.8 million tons of concentrated raw materials. So 23% of the use for animal feed. The most part was used for fattening, 5.5 million tons, then sows 1.3, and piglets 1 million tons. Two-thirds were processed to become feeds and pellets, and 1/3 was used directly without processing as FAF, and that includes maize and wet wheat. Here we have 71% cereals, 15% meals, 5% others, 8% grain byproducts being consumed by swine. In 2015, maize was the predominant grain cereal, followed by wheat, and soybean and sunflower meals were the main used one. Sorry, rapeseed and sunflower were the main used one, whereas soybean was only 19%. Now, I would like to look at soybean. On this Sankey diagram, we have the soybean simplified flow in France 2015. This diagram shows, first of all, that we are highly dependent on imports in France, especially for soybean meal. And cattle and poultry were the main consumers of soybean meal in 2015, and the swine industry was only in 5th position as far as soybean meal users are concerned. The results obtained from data reconciliation were then converted in proteins. In 2015, the need for French breeding was assessed at 15.1 million tons of proteins, 9.3 coming from fodder and 5.7 coming from concentrated raw materials. For concentrated raw material proteins, the bovine cattle seem to be the first consumer. Results also show that soya-derived proteins represent 11% of the total quantity of crude proteins being consumed in France, including fodder. And if we withdraw fodder, then 28% of the proteins were derived from concentrated raw materials. The results provided a new assessment of our autonomy in terms of sources of protein in France. There are several ways to calculate our protein-related autonomy. And in this study, we decided to define it as the ratio between proteins used by breeding of French origin versus the total use of proteins for the French breeding industry. Part of the proteins being produced in France are used for human food or exported. Therefore, they are not available for French breeders. And this is the reason why we did not compare the production of proteins in France with the quantity of proteins being consumed by breeding industry in France. This calculation is also the one used by the European Commission in order to calculate protein-related autonomy for European breeders. If we take all raw materials, fodders, and concentrated raw materials together, France's autonomy was assessed as 84%. Protein autonomy from raw materials was assessed at 59%. And finally, autonomy for proteins derived from protein-rich raw materials, that is, raw materials with a protein content higher than 15%, was assessed at 43%. In conclusion, one may say that the method used to reconciliate data is efficient to make various data from multiple sources consistent. We therefore know how to improve the method. We know to acquire better knowledge of the concentrated raw materials as used to feed herbivorous cattle and animals. And until now, we have less detailed information versus poultry. We also need to quantify the rate of protein used to convert fodder into proteins. And finally, we need to reconciliate data in one single stage, which is not what we did for different technical reasons, so that we can have better consolidated results. However, there was one advantage here. The results are shared by several industries, the plant industry, but also various breeding industries. Everybody met together and shared the data. And the results raised questions regarding sustainability of the feed industry for our animals, how to, for instance, use byproducts. And therefore, we are looking at continuing the work and making it perennial, in order to be able to reproduce the results every year so that we can monitor the flow of raw materials and proteins being used for feed over the years. Thank you very much for your attention. don't hesitate to log on to the J7 Élevage website because you will find additional information, graphs, or summaries and abstracts regarding the study. Thank you, Manon. Very clear, perfectly on time. I'm rather impressed. Could you remind us how long it took? How many people working on this particular study? Hello again. Well, the study started in 2017. For 2 years, we worked, well, it was full-time for 2 years. And then by the time we synthesized the results and used them for seminars like this one, over the 2 years, we had 2 different stages. The first stage, we processed and collected the data from the plant industry, the 17 different plant industries that I mentioned in the trial, or crops that I mentioned in the study. And then we looked at imports, processing, the whole processing system in France. It already represented a huge amount of work because there were statistics missing that we needed to acquire. And we had to substantiate all the statistical data, so that took about a year. And once we had found out what volume of raw materials are available for animal feed purposes, we decided to work on the needs of each breeding industry so that we could divide the consumption by breeding industry or by type of animals. You referred to the definition of protein autonomy. As far as you know, has anybody else in another European country conducted a similar work elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere across the world? Did you find any references of any similar study being conducted elsewhere? Well, I guess the subject has been looked at by many other researchers, and there are references across the world. And every time, I must say, it means that a huge quantity of data must be collected. And the point is that we need to understand on which data they've been working. No, but I'm not talking about statistics. I'm wondering whether anybody abroad has conducted such an exhaustive work anywhere else. Well, no, I wouldn't. No, I don't think so. Not that exhaustive, because we included all the crops upstream and then the animal feed industry downstream. So no, I don't think anybody has done something this exhaustive. In 2019, the European Commission suggested to divide this not by breeding industry, but rather by asked us to understand how we could use the raw materials for animal feed, but not divided by type of animal. Have you made a presentation to the DG, the Agriculture Director at the European Commission? No, we haven't. Okay, do you have questions? There are questions now coming. Could you describe the reconciliation method with the constraint optimization? I guess that would probably take a few minutes. Maybe you could contact Manon directly and discuss it with her. And for the slide regarding the division between the various types of raw materials, how do you consider the proportion consumed by man? And what is the percentage of cereals consumed by husbandry, by the breeding industry versus the total quantity produced? Is it clear? Yes, it is. Raw materials consumed by man or for human nutrition. Well, that was in a way the limitation. For instance, flour produced in France was something that we looked into. We also took in consideration flour being imported directly, but we did not take in consideration imports or exports of finished products. We did not look at pasta, for instance, imports and exports of pasta. Noodles. We looked at raw materials, not processed products. And I believe that this gives quite a good picture of the real situation. And as far as the division is concerned, what the quantity of cereals are consumed for human nutrition and what proportion for animal nutrition, I don't have that in mind. I would need to look at my figures, but I can provide the answer later. I have one last question, a very short question, ancillary question. We talk about the France Relance plan, but within the France Relance plan, there is a program to improve protein-related autonomy in France. Have you participated in any way? Did they ask you to participate when the project was designed? No, we weren't, not directly. However, the reference data we had produced have certainly been used by the ministry for their work, but they did not ask us directly to participate. But I guess, well, that was the whole point of our study, to provide reference data for others that could be used either directly by the breeding industry or by the ministry. So it is a decision-making tool for private or strategic decisions. Well, yes, that's the whole point of providing reference data, to help people take decisions. Thank you very much, Manon. Thank you. We move on. Second presentation. It will be delivered. It's effects of the change in protein nutrition of pigs and poultry, modeling at the on the French scale. Thomas Guilbaud will be delivering the presentation. He's a study engineer at Cereopa working in Nantes, and he works on animal nutrition and, well, agriculture as a whole on the technical level, but also on the economical, environmental, and sociological level. Thomas, you have the floor. You have 10 minutes. I'd like to introduce a work regarding effects of the change in protein nutrition of monogastric animal, pigs and poultry, modeling at the French scale. It's both an historical and prospective approach, and we will also focus on swine. So why look into nitrogen nutrition, protein nutrition of pigs and poultry? Well, there is a graph here showing that the nutritional constraint regarding crude protein represents 60% of the cost of feeding, finishing pigs. But there are also other considerations such as air, water, and soil pollution. Nitrogen peroxide is responsible for a large part of pollution. Here we see the share of agriculture and forests, 94% in France. And here we see a focus on ammonia emissions of agricultural origin, and swine contribute directly to ammonia emissions, 7%. Although we can't really quantify this, this share is much larger if we consider also the ammonia emissions connected with feed manufacturing. And we also have imports of palm oil and soybean meals, acting on global warming, but also raising a number of questions regarding biodiversity by society. Now, this tool, the prospective tool from Cereopa, was used to analyze the raw material market used by the industry manufacturing animal feed. It helps design supply in strategies. How does the model work? The model is based on 9 regions, which helps us assess synergies. The volume of feeds is considered at a 93% level. 72 raw materials are considered in terms of price, cost of transport, availability, origin, nutritional value. 65 feed formulae are defined based on information such as nutritional specifications, whether it contains NGOs or not, and labels and certifications. And finally, there's also an optimization model in order to optimize the supply cost and the environmental impact on the national level, or also to maximize local origin for the raw materials used to manufacture the feed. If we study the effect of on monogastric animals, we have two approaches. The first approach is the historical approach to assess the removal of synthetic amino acids. Initially, all amino acids were available. Simulations 1, 2, 3, and 4 consist in banning them successively, lysine, threonine, valine first, tryptophan, threonine, and lysine last. For this approach, a sensitivity analysis bearing on the greenhouse effect of important soya bean was performed. We have 2.5 equivalent CO2 per kilo of intermediate value between the ecoalim value, 1.37, and other data from international databases such as AgriFootprint, 5.6 equivalent CO2 per kilogram, or Global Feed LCA Institute, 4.29 equivalent CO2 by kilogram. The second approach is the prospective approach. It means that we push downwards the crude protein value in each type of feed for monogastric animals. We decrease by 1 point percentage and then 2. And the specification for amino acids are 100% of Hashimoto Animal Nutrition Europe recommendations for lysine and 97% of the recommendations for the other amino acids. Initially, all amino acids used in significant volumes on the market were available, and the using level depended on what kind of amino acid. The other arginine, histidine, isoleucine, leucine were considered as negligible. For MAT1 and MAT2 simulation, the use of amino acids were left free and were defined based on the optimization result. The same sensitivity analysis for GES intensity, greenhouse effect intensity for imported soya bean was applied here again. Now that the main assumptions have been described, this is the first result graph. Here we see the evolution of consumption for imported soya bean. And we have a gap here, that is the gap versus the initial situation. And vertically, we have the horizontally the withdrawal of various amino acids. Banning for amino acids led to an increase in the use of imported soya bean, 1.4 million tons, which means a 50% increase versus the current situation. This increase was divided 60% for swine nutrition, 30% for poultry, and 10% for bovine cattle and other kinds of feeds. The first result table for the prospective approach shows the evolution in the use of raw materials induced by the crude protein content in monogastric animal feed. Here we have total cereal use. The total use of cereals hasn't changed much. However, within cereals, replacing wheat with maize was a major process at MAT1. Wheat use decreased by 38%, whereas maize use was multiplied by 214%. And same for MA22, minus 91% for wheat, plus 539% for maize. Soya bean, we see that the main evolution about dehulled sunflower meal, and we also have oil seeds with a huge change in their consumption. Finally, amino acid volumes have increased respectively by 6 million tons and then 14,000 tons, sorry, in the most demanding formulae. For nutritional purposes, crude protein decrease can only be obtained by increasing amino acid consumption. Here we have a summary of the greenhouse gas effect induced by removal of amino acid, historical approach, and generated also by the decrease of crude proteins in the various approaches, in the various feeds. Positive significant evolution in dark green, barely significant evolution in light green, and non-significant evolution in gray. We see here that banning amino acids induced a slowdown in a decrease in green emission gases, but no decrease was observed when we removed or decreased crude protein content. banning amino acids induced a decrease in protein autonomy. And finally, decrease in crude protein content in the feeds led to an increase by 2 points and 1 and 4 respectively for French-made feeds. The last graph is about the decrease of crude protein in the feeds for monogastric animals, a prospective approach. We see here the impact on ammonia emissions. Here we have in percentage the estimate of emission reduction versus the current situation divided per species. And horizontally, we see the two simulations, MT -1 and MAT -2, or crude protein -1 and -2. The decrease in crude protein content in feeds leads to a reduced ammonia emission due to dejections. These reductions are 7% for MAT -1 and 13% for MAT -2 as far as swine is concerned. On the model regarding all monogastric animals, these reductions in ammonia emissions are 10% for MA2 -1 and 20% for MA2 -2. Ammonia emission reductions have a cost, represent an overcost. The overcost for the swine industry estimated per ton of feed is €2 for the 1 point crude protein reduction and €9 for a 2 point crude protein reduction, which means 1 and 4% of the cost of formulae. In absolute value, this represents an overcost of €11 million for the swine industry and €47 million for MAT -2. And if we take the whole model, the additional cost reaches €60 million and €200 million respectively for MAT -1 and MAT -2 simulation. In conclusion, here we have substantiated the idea according to which integrating amino acid in the industry for animal feeding has contributed to reducing the use of soybean imports in the last decades, 50% approximately. The swine industry decreased its dependence towards soybean imports. A prospective analysis shows that we still have room for maneuver and we can still decrease the crude protein in content, approximately 20%. There is still a potential to reduce ammonia emission in connection with crude protein content reduction. And finally, one must note that the potential impact must be confirmed either by informing and educating consumers or by supporting the public administration.
Merci beaucoup, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'd like to give the floor now to Christine, who is going to be our question interpreter. Well, I encourage you to post your questions on the Q&A function. Let me have a look. There are no questions. I have two. I have two here. First, a technical question. Why did you choose 100% of the recommendations for lysine and 97% for the other amino acids in the prospective approach? First question. And the second question, and I will ask you both questions so you may answer at the same time. The higher price for feed, is that the only reason to justify that the crude protein content has not been reduced? Is it an economic issue? And the environmental benefit? What about the environmental benefit? Are there regulations being planned or looked into? And who's going to pay for the additional cost? You said that we needed to educate the consumers and make them accept to pay for the overcost, the additional cost. So could you elaborate? And first question, the recommendations, 100% for lysine and 97% for the other amino acids. Well, that was a choice. That was a decision we took because we thought that the lysine the lysine needs were more accepted by animal feed manufacturers. For the other amino acids, there was a bit of flexibility that the feed manufacturers, feed producers adopted. So that was just an assumption. That's a decision we took based on the Europa expertise and the discussions we had with our partners. But it's just an assumption. It's just a hypothesis on which we can apply sensitivity analysis. And the second question, it seems to show that if we reduce total crude protein, we reduce, there is an environmental benefit because it reduces ammonia emissions. So why wasn't it adopted? Well, there's a major benefit. I mean, we work with this model regarding ammonia emissions due to waste and feces dejections from monogastric animals, i.e. pigs and poultry, and with a special focus on swine. We're talking 10%, sometimes even more, depending on whether we use the MAT-1 or -2 simulation. But the way we set up the model was the following. We tried to assess the initial situation, i.e. the 2017-2018 situation. At the time, we assessed the average, the way most farms worked, so the average emission, and then we offered to decrease crude protein content, decreasing ammonia emissions. And when we add an additional constraint or stress on the system, as I said in the presentation, we reduce even further. So that's the model, that's the way the model works. It reduces the cost of supply at the national level. So if we apply a constraint, a stress, by construction, the price will increase, the cost will increase. We have two quick questions, and unfortunately they will be the last because otherwise we're going to run late. First question, so maybe a very short question. Total crude protein decrease has a positive impact on the environment, but what about performances? And second, what is the hypothesis chosen for methionine? Okay, regarding performances, we talk in terms of ISO performances, because that's precisely why we adopted the amino acid recommendations. We follow the principle of the ideal protein, not that there's a sufficient quantity of protein, but rather the amino acids, because the amino acids help reconstitute the proteins within the animal's body. So we're talking performances. And for methionine, well, this is not quite the last version, but okay, never mind. We don't talk about methionine in this particular version, but methionine is the second amino acid used by feed manufacturers, and obviously it has been integrated in the model. But in this case, the study only regarded the other amino acids and not methionine because of the partnership. We wrote this study together with Ajinomoto, so we worked on the amino acids that are produced and released by Ajinomoto.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And anyway, if you have any other questions that you haven't had time to ask, I encourage you to contact directly Thomas, and he will be more than happy to provide all the necessary information, and you can look at the proceedings. And we now move to the third presentation. This will be the synthesis, so it's a longer presentation. It will last longer. The speaker will be Caroline Depoudent. Caroline is an agronomer engineer, and she is in charge of working conditions within the Chambre d'Agriculture in Brittany. And she's also the co-moderator for a mixed network for people working in breeding farms. So Caroline, you have 20 minutes. The floor is yours. And there will be then 10 minutes for Q&A. So do not forget to post your questions as we go.
Sur le travail en élevage porcin et plus
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to present to you a summary entitled Working in Pig Farms, Factors of Attraction and Constraints. We worked together with Lisa and Nathalie. We received funds for improved working conditions and the CASDAR fund. Now, in the course of the JRP Swine Research Seminar, we took an interest in the French herd. some 13 million pigs. And in this summary, we are planning to focus on their caretakers. In France, as many as 12,700 people work in French farms. So we're talking 6,700 breeders and almost 6,000 workers. So there's a twofold constraint. 50% of the breeders are over 50 years old, which means that they're going to go into retirement soon. So how do we replace the aging generation? In addition, the labor market is under pressure for pig farm workers. Positions are hard to fill. So for decades, we have looked for ways to enhance the sector's attractiveness. As part of this summary, we're looking at how we can make sure people stay in their jobs and train future generations of farms. So we're looking at the different aspects of their work. Why do they do this job? What about their working conditions? Why are they in this line of work? What about the impact of the job on their health? We'll also look at the upsides and constraints of working in pig farms and also potential solutions we can explore. This summary is based on data. Most of the data comes from conventional pig farms in the greater West region of France. And when data exists on other types of farms, we have consolidated it. We also have foreign data on specific aspects, particularly occupational health. Let's get started. Breeders and farm workers, what do they do? We will look at different aspects. What kind of farms do they work in? What about their working hours? What about the specific features of a pig farm? And people who do work in pig farms, how do they fit into a network of relationships that connect the farm to the outside world? Let's start with the French pig farms, the people that we're interested in. Well, most of them work in farms that are companies, so 78%. 46% are payroll employees, and 39 farms specialize in pig farming. Otherwise, pig rearing is combined with crops or other livestock. 99% of the farms, or the pigs rather, are housed indoors. Now, on average, in French farms, the working time is 16.2 hours per sow per year, the equivalent of 120 sows per labor unit per year, and this excludes on-farm feed production, experimental stations, and other plants. If we look at changes over time, we find there's a regular reduction in working time. This is due to two factors. First of all, the pig farms are getting bigger, and also they're using automation more and more. If we look at this curve, and it's highly linear, however, there's a high degree of variability from pig to farm. Figures can as much as double or triple between the lowest working time and the highest working time. So a high degree of variability because of different factors, including automation, specialist workforce. This workforce is much more specialized, is even more specialized in large farms. The presence of bedding, which can increase working time, and also human factors such as the breeder profile. So the most recent studies show that entrepreneur style farmers tend to work less per sow per year. So if we look at the pace of work, we find that 2/3 of workers and 45% of breeders have at least 2 weekends free out of 3, and half of breeders take over 2 weeks off per year. Now, if we break down the working time, so 16 hours per sow per year, 44% goes to daily activities, so feeding, monitoring, etc. The other aspects include farrowing, caregiving, transfers, cleaning and washing, etc. So in pig farms, the pace of work is governed by the production cycles. So farmers have a choice between a regular schedule, week in, week out, or alternating between busy weeks and even busier weeks. And when it's just a busy week, you have time for other things. Now, what's specific about pig farms? You work indoors. where it's warm, and that's attractive to some people. And the working time is closer to business hours, and that's easier to reconcile with your family life than if you're working, for example, the beef or dairy cattle industry. Now, if we look at this network of relationships that farmers or farms are part of, there's several people working there. So partners, workers, or both. Most of the work is teamwork. And what we're seeing is how important interpersonal skills are. Interpersonal relationships, that's key to creating a pleasant working environment and on holding on to your workers. Now, at a higher level, the farm is part of a farming community of an industry. Various studies have shown that over time, peer relationships wane as farmers focus more on their own farms. And also, there's fewer incoming and outgoing movements for biosafety reasons. So, the farmer, however, retains strong ties with the community. The farm is part of a local and regional fabric. So, what we find, breeding projects may not be accepted or approved by all. It depends on the season and on the region. Also, what we're seeing is that it's important for the farmers to be part of the community and of society at large. There's a positive perception and trust vis-a-vis breeders. So being part of the community, enjoying the trust of the public constitutes a layer of protection in case of conflicts, in case of opposition. Farmers are part of the world, part of society, but society's feelings towards pig farming are ambivalent. So on the one hand, they're challenging production methods, and those methods have evolved over time because issues include pollution of water in particular, and health concerns and animal welfare. But society also has a very positive perception of breeders. And so breeders are at the heart of this ambivalence. So we've taken stock of the position of pig farms in the industry. Now let's take a closer look at why breeders and workers have decided to do what they do. So we distinguish between breeders, workers, and prospective workers because conditions for access to this job are different. If we look at breeders, for example, the important aspect is that in over 90% of cases, breeders decide to set up shop, to start their own business, and there's a strong sense of entrepreneurship. They want to be their own boss. It's a very important aspect. The second thing that crops up is that they're passionate about their jobs. A number of studies have been conducted that are looking at the meaning of work when you're a farmer, particularly a pig farmer. So there's a variety of different profiles among the pig farming community. So here we have 4 different profiles. You have a heritage or legacy-minded farmer. So the farmer is a pillar of the community. They believe in a family business. And then you have the craftsman type, which is driven by technical performance. And then you have the animal lovers. They love being around the animals. They love cultivating that relationship. And then you have the entrepreneurs who prioritize technical and economic optimization as well as team management. Now, compared with other sectors of the economy, there is a higher proportion of entrepreneurs among pig farmers than in other sectors. So entrepreneurial spirit is more widespread in this field. Now, regarding farm workers, why did they choose this work? First of all, they like to work with animals, or they have specific interest or affinity for pigs. This particular profession is buoyant. There's a lot of work, particularly in rural areas, and also working conditions and working times are more attractive than in other sectors of agriculture. So for people who already have jobs, they love to be their own man. They get to organize their work independently. And the second aspect that crops up is that they love to see for themselves the fruit of their labor. When you see the number of winners that are still healthy thanks to you, and you see a clean room after a hard day's work, you get immediate feedback on the quality of your work, and it's highly motivational. The third aspect is the fact that they love to work with animals. Prospective workers, various studies show similar results. The main aspects include, okay, an interest in working with animals, the need to respect animal welfare, but also the need to imbue your tasks with meaning. You want to understand the ins and outs of your job and the whys and hows of your task or where the farm stands on its trajectory. And thirdly, human relationships. You need a sense of belonging. That's what drives retention. So we've covered all the angles. We understand now why people work in pig farms. You have a strong entrepreneurship among breeders. You have the love of animals, and this is common to both farmers and farm workers. And then you have the love for the technical content of the job. That's where the attraction lies, and that's why people stay. Now, let's look at consequences on health. Many studies have looked at health at work in pig farms. Because the clock is ticking, we decided to focus on two different aspects: RSI, repetitive strain injury on the one hand, and psychosocial risks on the other. In pig farms, from the point of view of physical health, the number of occupational injuries is similar to other farming sectors. When it comes to occupational diseases, we're slightly above the average for the entire sector, but the rates is similar to to the cattle industry and the poultry industry. So what do we have? RSI and back problems. As is the case in other sectors of agriculture, RSI accounts for 9 occupational diseases in 10. In the survey, 7 breeders out of 10 reported back problems. So where does RSI originate? Well, the constraints of physical activity. The constraints of physical activity. RSI emerges when the job requires a pace of work and a level of strength that exceeds the individual's capabilities. So you have risk factors: aging, being a woman, when your physical or your psychological status is deteriorated, and also repetitive tasks, for example, providing care to piglets, or when you have to stand in uncomfortable postures or positions for a long time, for example, when you're cleaning or washing. Those are risk factors. And other health problems have been documented in connection with your quality, for example. If you have any questions, please ask them through the chat box. Now, psychosocial risks, mental health problems. Obviously, these are risks irrespective of the company, whether or not it's a farm. This means there's an imbalance between organizational relational constraints and available resources. This leads to psychosocial risk. Depending on the source, we get different results in terms of pig farms or farms in general. Exposure studies, large-scale exposure studies, such as the summer survey, considers that by and large in farms, the work organization is satisfactory for 85% of workers. People feel empowered. So the result is rather positive. However, there are other studies on suffering at work or on farmers' suicides, and there are psychosocial risks because there's a disconnect between the actual work as it is being done and the work and how the person wants to do that work. Now, what about prevention of psychosocial risk? You need to take into account various areas. Pressure, for example, pressure from the family, pressure from red tape, conflicts of values when you have to do something that you don't like, when you have to hurt the animal or duck the tail, for example. And also the fact that your production methods are being challenged by society. On the other hand, in order to prevent psychosocial risks, both farmers and workers can rely on the work collective and the quality of human relationships within the farm. No sound. Still no sound.
On a un petit problème, je crois.
We seem to be having slight technical difficulties. Now, based on all this, how do we replace aging populations? How do we find new people to work? in farms. We can review the different aspects. If we look at the jobs market, we can say that the pig farming sector is a dynamic one. There are jobs available in rural areas, in different types of farms with different sizes for the teams and different prospects for career evolution. You can set up your own shop, you can start your own business, you can graduate to a supervising position. Now, working conditions. You work with animals, and that's very attractive. You get to work indoors. This can be a problem for some people, but some people prefer to work indoors because it's warm there. Workers get good pay, and also the working hours are under control and they're predictable. Now, areas that you need to pay attention to, repetitive tasks, and this can lead to RSI. This is a significant risk, and also the working environment can involve constraints in terms of quality of life. What about the actual content of the work? It's a technical work, and that's a good thing. Well, for most people, it can be a problem for others. You get to work with animals, and an important aspect in terms of motivation. It's a kind of job where you're quick to see the outcome of your work, because fast rotation between production cycles means you get feedback right away, and that's a type of recognition you get for your hard work. Well, in addition to the recognition you get from your peers and your supervisor. Now, in terms of relationships, mostly you work as part of a team, and that's a source of motivation. And it's also an extra layer of protection against psychosocial risks. And also, human relationships are a reason to be happy at work. However, even if this job is rather well managed in terms of pig farms, there's always room for improvement, both in-house in terms of personnel management or relationships between partners, but also externally outside the farm. Relationships can further improve between pig farms and society to reduce the risk of tension. By way of conclusion, there are several avenues we can explore to improve work in pig farms and also get new generations to replace the current one. Dialogue must be strengthened at the local level. Uh, Dialogue with your neighbors and other stakeholders in the local and regional fabric, and your communication should be based on technical aspects because you get to describe your job, you quantify and objectify the facts, but also you need a little bit of emotion. You need to talk about what makes sense in your job. You get to work with animals, why you do it, and this is important in terms of your relationship with the rest of society. Another solution would be to promote recruitment in terms of targeting candidates who are transitioning from a different profession, pardon me, and are looking for more autonomy. Not everybody wants to work not everybody wants to work indoors, however. A lot of people decided to work in farming or to train in agricultural methods because they want to work outdoors. So maybe it's a better idea to target candidates who are transitioning from a different profession. And what they want to be is empowered. They want a relationship with, they want to work with animals, but they may have fewer expectations. And this could broaden the pool of potential recruits. Now, if we look at making sure that the people who are currently working in pig farms actually stay there, we can further improve the buildings, the feedlots, the equipment to make the job easier, to reduce arduousness. Also, diversity of users must be taken into account, whether we're talking the feedlots or the equipment. So irrespective of size or the level of strength or your age or your sex, everybody should feel comfortable in their jobs and feel happy to be at work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Caroline.
Caroline.
Vous nous brossez finalement un tableau assez rose de la
Think about it. This is, you're looking at the situation with pink sunglasses, aren't you? It's an attractive job working in pig farms, whether you're the actual farmer or whether you're just a farmhand. So outside observers may be surprised considering the fact that pig farm projects in rural areas are often find a lot of opposition. Now, you're part of this joint technology and network, this RMT. Do you have a baseline? Can you compare the pig farm situation with other types of farming in terms of attractiveness? How attractive is pig farming relative to poultry farming, cattle farming, etc.? Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that you're happy with this positive feedback, because in previous editions I was told that the situation was gloomy. Well, it's important to attract new farmhands, new farmers, renew the aging generations, but relative to other types of farm, the type of profile that we're looking to attract is entrepreneurs, people who are interested in setting up their own business, managing a company. At the end of the day, whether or not they love animals or whether they're simply interested, that's secondary. And as far as farmhands are concerned, we want technical driven profiles. Now, relative to other types of farming, there's one profile that stands out. There's a sense of wanting to go back to nature, wanting to do a job that makes sense. For goats or sheep, for example, there are lots of people. There are lots of people who want to set up their own business. What about the family aspect? Well, 9%. I think the summary contains the figure 9% are people who set up their own business. Either they used to be a farmhand or they're setting up their own business, but in any case, contrary to other types of farming, they're not here to go back to nature. There are 4 different questions in the right order, so please keep the answers concise. Do you know why, when it comes to concept business and health, one risk factor is your gender, whether you are a higher risk if you're a woman? Well, in terms of RSI, repetitive strain injury, there are risk factors because of repetitive tasks. And most often, women spend a lot of time in the farrowing room, so in the post-weaning phase. And there's a lot of repetitive tasks. They provide care to piglets and they don't move around that much. And also because the workstations and the tools are sized for an average sized worker, and usually that's an average sized man, which means that the tools, for example, injectors, whatever, by definition has been designed and sized for a man, which means more RSI for women. Second question. Now, the areas, the things that to look out for. Other similarities between the areas that require special attention between breeders and actual farms. We don't have enough data on the topic. I can't tell you whether there's a disconnect. What about workers and breeders and their sense of disease, which has been described by INRAE researchers such as Josselin Porter? To keep it short, are they unhappy? I guess it all depends on your approach. We find that if the study targets unhappiness at work or suffering at work, and you have specifically targeted samples, maybe. Yeah, obviously some tasks are not pleasant. When you have to castrate a pig, it's no fun for the person doing it, because potentially you're hurting the pig, and that's not why I'm in. That's not why I decided to do this job. So some tasks are unpleasant, and this is true for other farming sectors as well. By and large, if we're using standard indicators, by and large, you have a lot of discretion in terms of the decisions you make. You receive support from the rest of the team. You're empowered to get organized. And in the sample, most of breeders and farmers, they feel good about their job. Now, there's a risk of intrusion and the fact that your farming practices may come into question. We have questions of a more technical nature. Now, the level of motivation is different, whether you're a breeder or whether you're a prospective breeder. In one case, you want to be your own boss. In the other case, you want to work with animals. Is there an age effect in this difference? And does this mean that things could change as future breeders get older? Or is this a generational effect, which means an actual change? So setting up your own business to be your own boss versus love of animals and wanting to work with animals. Well, usually when you set up your own business, when you start your own farm, you probably come from a family that's done it before. So your father is a farmer and you want to start your own farm. And you know the job already. So there's the relationships are important in terms of wanting to work with animals and a sense of connection. This is something we see in vocational high schools. The question has disappeared, says the speaker. And so allow me to repeat the question. There seems to be a generational aspect that influences how important it is to work with animals. Yes, there's a generational impact, and also it's a different type of job. For example, if you really love animals and you get off on spending time with pigs, then obviously you don't want to start a business where you'll be managing a team of 4 to 5 people because you won't be in direct contact with the animals. Another question. The return to nature, the fact that there is no such thing in a pig farm as opposed to a more external aspect, as opposed to the fact that in other types of farms, for example, goat or sheep, they get to work outdoors. How do you explain this dichotomy? Well, even when you work with sheep, you don't necessarily develop a special rapport with every single sheep, particularly if you're using straw bedding. So there aren't that many people willing to switch from goat farming to pig farming simply because they want to spend time outdoors. One last question. Strengthening dialogue with society, whose job is it? Is it the breeder? Is it the breeder's job? And how can we set that up? How do we strengthen dialogue with society? Whose job is it? Well, this can be done at several levels. Now, I think the onus is on the breeder to cultivate his relationship with the local and regional fabric, his neighbors, elected officials in the local municipality, so that people will know him, so that there's a climate of trust, so that if there's a problem, they will come and talk to them instead of the problem escalating into conflict and people from the outside butting in. This is how you establish credibility, so that if there's a problem, people will trust him. So now, as far as relationships between breeders and the rest of society, it's not just a single breeder who can stand single-handedly make a difference. No, it's the entire breeding community, with maybe mass communication campaigns. It's been done in Brittany. We all have to chip in. We all have a contribution to make. I have a question because I found this very surprising when I read your summary. I'm not certain that that's something you emphasized, but the criteria for hiring farmhands. Okay, most of pig farmers are payroll employees. So criteria number 1, motivation, then gender, then geographic proximity, and the 4th criteria is the experience and the skills. So basically, the first criteria is how motivated you are. It doesn't really matter if you have no experience or no skills. You'll get the training. Yes, for a long time, there's been a chronic deficit to farmhands. And so breeders are used to treating people coming in from other fields, and a lot of people tell me, a lot of breeders tell me, it doesn't matter if they don't know anything about the job, as long as they're willing to work hard and willing to learn, I don't care. So obviously, if there's a choice, they'll prioritize somebody who's got the skills and who's got the experience. But what matters most is the motivation. And I think that this is rather specific. The pig farming community is able to bring in different types of profiles. You could have had you could have been a salesman in a past life, and it doesn't matter what you used to do. You can get the training and become a farmhand. Thank you very much, Caroline. Okay, so the next talk, let's get back to economic considerations. Let's move away a little bit from sociology, even though sociological concerns are very important in farms and pig farms in particular. The impact of the COVID-19 crisis on meat consumption and distribution in France. This is a talk by Valérie Diot. Valérie, you have the floor.
Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon. I would like to discuss with you the impact that the COVID-19 sanitary crisis has had on distribution and consumption of pork products in France. The study was conducted with Boris Duflot's help and funded by INAPER and France Agriculture. First of all, we're going to have a look at the data used for this to frame this study. Pork products consumption has been eroded progressively and decreased over years, but partial closure of restaurants during the period from March to May 2020 following the sanitary crisis has deeply changed consumer habits regarding both consumption and purchase of pork products. This has changed consumption versus other species, and we're trying to understand the transient adjustment methods. Following monitoring the consumption between January and July was performed based on data from weekly sales in self-service supermarkets according to Nielsen, household consumption according to Kantar, promotional activity based on panel A3 distribution, and individual consumption for meat products resulting from the Sèvres-Credoc opinion poll. Before we looked at the impact of the sanitary crisis, we have to have a look at the consumption of meat products before the crisis, because decrease in the purchasing volume in 5 years between 2014 and 2019 regarding home consumption, we record minus 20% for pork meat, minus 7% for processed products and sausages. And we see that the decrease in purchasing volume is all the more pronounced that when the products are less processed. Poultry and rabbits have decreased more slowly, minus 1%. Poultry is considered as a healthy and easily accessible product. For bovine meat, the fall is only 7%, but we find an increase in consumption outside of the restaurants. Relative stability of mock meat, but restaurant consumption does not allow to compensate for the loss of consumption outside of restaurants and at home. There are economic and sociological factors explaining the decrease in consumption. First of all, a slowdown in demographic growth. Less babies are being born, minus 8.4%, and also the population is growing older. 1 out of 5 French people is more than 65 years old, and people who eat less to be healthy and try to limit waste in order to preserve the planet. Now, this awareness has led to more people becoming flexitarians, that is, they eat less meat versus the average. And according to a Credoc study for France Agriculture Mer and Lusha in 2019, they represent 20% of the population. And we have to add the smaller number of people who are vegetarians or vegans, 5.2%. To be noted that educated people actually have known a faster decrease of meat consumption. Now, during the sanitary crisis, what was the transfer of consumption to the benefit of pig? Restaurants have lost 40% of their turnover in the first semester of 2020 versus 2019. How did the transfer happen towards home consumption? The purchasing volume for households shows that right at the beginning of the crisis, pork meat went up plus 12% in March, plus 23% in April. And poultry followed the same trend, March plus 4%, April plus 22%. However, bovine meat went down 2% in March, but up 10% in April. Mussels and cuts, which are normally eaten in restaurants, did not find any outlets as far as home consumption is concerned. And transfer happened towards minced meat, which is cheaper. And also the transfer was to the benefit of pig and poultry. Part of the consumers moved away from bovine meat to go towards pork and poultry. Sausages went up faster than fresh pork meat. April plus was 61%, also aided by good weather. And finally, restaurants closing down, considering that they consume import products, has also helped relocate the offer in France. Pork meat imports 20% in 2000 April. So in conclusion, pig became a kind of sanctuary for consumption with high penetration levels, with a price which was actually satisfactory for people looking for proteins for primary needs. So what does the sales analysis show from supermarkets, i.e. 70% of the outlets for home consumption? The fact that people moved away from traditional meat sales due to the fact that part of the shops were closed has transferred the sales habits, the purchasing habits towards supermarkets. If we look at the weekly volume for fresh pork meat and self-service sausages and processed meat, means that plus 35% of pork meat was bought and plus 33% for sausages and processed meat. And the sales remained very high during the following weeks. So it's plus 36% for fresh pork meat and processed meat, 32%. Then the shops reopened, but elderly people did not go back to them necessarily. The average price for self-service meat was plus 6% over January to July, if we compare with 2019, but the prices lost 20 centimes over the period. And distributor brands had lost 5.3 points of volume between 2014 and 18, but they gained again with the Egalim law 2019 versus the national brands. During the crisis, main brands actually acted reassuringly, and people started trying to limit the expense and went back towards brand distributors to the expense of national brands, plus 9.6%. At the same time, the fact that advertising decreased means that processed meat lost 33%. So distributor brands increased faster than national brands. What are the effects of the crisis regarding reconfiguration of distribution? In 2020, 6% of French people live less than 5 minutes away from a hypermarket, 28% for supermarkets and 32% for smaller shops, according to Nielsen. The crisis encourage consumers to go towards more accessible offers versus the price. Therefore, between December 2019 and July 2020, we see that people have changed their purchasing habit and to the expense of hypermarkets, minus 2.9%. And not only are hypermarkets less accessible, but also people have moved away during the crisis towards the countryside, and this has helped the phenomenon. And therefore, smaller supermarkets have gone up plus 0.9%. Home delivery and e-commerce have picked up speed, 1.8 points, especially for elderly people. For processed meat between 2019 and 2020, the number of buyers has doubled. However, distribution players have capitalized on this enthusiasm, especially because they had already started the transition towards the digital market. Physical market has lost 0.7 points, and the use of digital technologies for click and collect and home delivery through a specialized circuit has picked up speed. In conclusion, regarding consumption and distribution of pork meat, some new balances are appearing for the short term. It appears that we have lost the sound.
Pour conclure,
in conclusion, regarding distribution and consumption of pork meat products, some new balances are appearing for the short term, and this will last with the crisis. Not only has pork meat become more attractive, but the crisis has changed the way people cook at home and share meals with their family. People working from home now are 34% at the highest point of the crisis versus 3% only in 2017. So this change could become partially perennial, and it could support the consumption of pork meat, and also more fragmented consumption rhythms with video drinks or breaks are something that will become perennial and encourage the consumption of salami, for instance. However, we need to acquire more and better understanding of behavior, consumer behavior, with new studies taking consideration the fact that there is a bigger financial gap. 33% of people have lost part of their income, and the price has become a new motivation for purchasing, especially for brand distributors. And there is a stronger link between nutrition and health, which encourages the development of quality pork meat products for those consumers who can afford it. The crisis has also developed digital tools, but there is still a digital divide. 15% of French people do not use digital tools. E-commerce should continue developing, changing and adapting the offer in order to make recently converted households more loyal. Distribution circuits have become more fragmented for the benefit of specialized circuits, especially with a very specific number of brands to whom the consumers will become increasingly loyal. Thank you very much, Valérie. I'm sorry, I did not introduce you before you started your presentation. Valérie, you are an engineer in the pole economy at IFIP and also an active member of RMT, specializing in distribution and consumption of pork meat, pork meat products. No questions on the chat, but I do have some questions myself. They came to me as I was listening. You talked about the fact that advertising and promotional prices stopped during the first lockdown. Now, this was especially discussed when the Loi Egalim came to the forefront. So where do we stand right now? Well, advertising promotions during 2020, as soon as we came out of the lockdown in June, advertising started again, and it is actually an indicator more than just a word. We record the number of operations, leaflets and promotional campaigns, and the number of references being activated is also something we take into consideration. During the summer, this went down, and late 2020, there was a pickup phenomenon again, especially for pork meat in November. Now, surprisingly, promotional or advertising pressure changed, and the regional campaigns decreased versus the national campaigns. So local campaigns decreased versus national campaigns. One might be tempted to say, well, what difference does it make for the industry itself? What it does, because regarding the processing companies, there are many players in the field of processed pork meat who work locally, very small companies who work locally, and for whom this kind of local promotional campaign is more interesting, because otherwise they are too far away from the offer and the offer dynamic. I have now seen a few questions coming up on the Q&A chat function. The plant industry has observed a decrease in the consumption of organic food production following the crisis. Did this happen for pork meat, organic pork meat? Well, I'm not too privy to the situation in the field of organically grown plants and vegetables, but I can tell you about organic pork meat. Now, the situation is slightly different from the other kinds of organic food industries, because if we look at the overall picture, there seems to be a scissor effect between supply and demand. Either the offer is ahead of supply and supply increases to catch up, and then it plateaus because there is too much offer versus too much supply versus the offer. We call that the scissor effect. But for pork meat, it's a matter of carcass balance, because what we sell is the front part. And in order to discuss the sanitary crisis again, although in the media, they reported strong enthusiasm towards organic grown or bred products, it doesn't show in the figures. In late 2020, the situation seemed to plateau versus 2019, which had been a very good year, maybe one or two figures, but I don't think it's going to be very helpful. Well, time is flying, and there are other questions, but I will take two. There is one question regarding short-circuit sales. Is this evolution going to become perennial? Do you have any figures? And the second question is, what is the impact of the crisis on the profitability of investments made by breeders to provide more well-being for the animals? And is this going to, is animal well-being going to be taken in consideration regarding the price of pork meat for consumers? I'm sorry, I forgot the first question. First question was about short circuits. Oh, yes, okay. Sorry, short circuits. Do we have figures? No, we don't. We have estimates. And for pork meat, it seems to be minus 2%. Why? Well, we have derived data from the Kantar opinion polls regarding direct sales, except that direct sales are not the first circuit. What actually, it's the producers' shops that are developing fastest. And we have trouble keeping track of what they do. But we're not anywhere near 5%. If we compare with bovine meats, 4 to 5%. Okay. Thank you. Now, it's been developing for vegetables and plants. There are many short-circuit players, but we're talking very limited volumes. You know, in order to have a livelihood, they don't need to slaughter many animals every year, so it's sort of diluted. So in one sentence, please. Please, just one sentence. What about premium products in this background regarding well-being? Okay, well-being, animal well-being. People look at the labels and the packaging, except that only represents part of the issue. Animal well-being can also be explained by processing companies having a more company responsibility attitude. And so supermarkets also have to take that into consideration. I myself, based on the numerous discussions I had with some of the players, my opinion is, yes, people want to go for it. And distributors sometimes say, well, we don't have any other options anyway. We have to go in that direction, more well-being. It's a matter of market access conditions. It's becoming a condition to gain access to the market. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not necessarily very transparent for consumers. It's mainly expressed in specifications, and distributor brands plays an essential role for some products such as ham, but it's very difficult to understand what impact this is going to have on the prices and the yield, but not going for it. It means that you lose your chances of having a perennial trade. Well, there were many more questions, and probably more than people didn't even have time to type on the chat. But again, if you have questions, you may contact directly Valérie. And who was your co-author? Boris Duflot. And you can ask them the questions directly. Thank you very much, Valérie. Thank you. Now we move on to the next presentation. And we're going to move upwards again towards the upstream part of the pig industry economy. We're going to talk about price setting, a comparison between European countries and American countries. Elisa Husson is an engineer for the economic department at IFIP and also the chief editor for Baromètre Report, our monthly magazine. She's going to deliver the talk, and then she will be answering the questions. Hello, everybody. I'd like to introduce the main results from a study we conducted on the marketing and the way the prices are set for pigs in some European countries and North American countries. The study was conducted thanks to the help provided by the Marché du Port Breton. There were two main orientations. The first one was to characterize the way the market is organized, describing the players and the way the transactions are operated. The organizations of the relationship between buyers and sellers are oriented in several factors: geographical location, what other alternatives are available for the breeders versus their clients, and the slaughterhouses versus their suppliers. Another factor is the existence of common investments, such as brands or specifications or capitalistic ties. And one third factor is the existence of possible commercial dependence between buyers and sellers, such as contracts or regular relationships. The second study orientation was about the construction and application of real transactions of reference prices. Who are the players participating in setting the prices, and what influence does the reference price have on real prices? These studies were conducted based on a bibliography study, discussions with experts, and sectorial data analysis. The geographical scope was several important production areas, but I will focus today on three: Germany, Spain, and France. In Germany, the market is characterized by players upstream and downstream who are both numerous and not grouped. Germany occupies a central role in Europe, and there is a high flow of live animals and cuts, and sales is conducted in competition, and many players intermediaries are present. Therefore, we can talk about a liberal market. The price is set on the market by the confrontation between buyers and sellers. 5 different sales circuits are available in Germany. First of all, when pigs are being sold within a slaughtering cooperative, for instance, Westfleisch in Germany, pigs can also be sold directly by a trade cooperative, and the ownership is transferred from the breeder to the cooperative. The breeders can also go through an intermediary, a trader, who sell the pigs. The fourth circuit is that of producer associations, which offer technical services to the breeders, and also are in charge of setting the price without ownership transfer. They call it Zeugerringe. And the last circuit is direct sales between breeders and slaughterers. The same breeder can be member of a production association, a cooperative, and also another type of organization. There is also the Vereinigungspreis, the reference prize, based on the discussion between 8 producer organizations who first of all collected information from the market, including bait prices from production federations in the northwest of Germany. In reality, in spite of the existence of the Vereinigungspreis, the negotiation is very complex and not transparent. Each slaughtering house will define its own rules to determine the price paid to the supplier. And Tönnies and Beyond, the main 2 slaughterers, produce their own bait prices. The relationship between offer and supply and demand is the main criteria for price setting, and prices are continuously being adjusted on the markets. Now, if we look at the Spanish market, one of the main characteristics is the fact that integration and contracting are very important. They represent more than 80% of the pigs being produced. But in spite of a growing concentration, the breeding players in Spain are very numerous, and slaughterers are also numerous, and the tools are divided in a more concentrated way in Catalonia, for instance. Verticalization is gathering strength, and with investment of integrators in slaughtering and transformation, more than 20% of pigs raised by integrators are slaughtered within the same company. But integrators continue to sell and buy pigs with other suppliers and buyers. With this organization, trading modes are different, but mainly this is a mutual agreement between the private or cooperative integrators and slaughterers. Only a very small share of the pigs being sold in Spain, 5% are sold directly between an independent breeder and a slaughterer. Every week there is a negotiation between 8 representatives of slaughtering houses and 8 from production. 40% of the pigs slaughtered in the country are represented by the companies participating in this negotiation. Following this negotiation, the Mercoleda quote is considered as the main reference price on the pig market, and it is the payment basis for 90% of pigs being sold in Spain. The French market is characterized by a collective organization. Pig breeders are organized in producers' organizations, and they account for 90% of the production. These organizations are in charge of buying and selling, collecting and paying pigs, and therefore they also take a part of the risk. Some of these organizations share capitalistic ties with the upstream or downstream companies, such as genetics, feeding, and slaughtering. Now, the upstream sector is organized, and now the downstream or slaughtering is also getting organized. The majority of French pigs are produced by a very small number of slaughtering houses for historical or geographical reasons, or even capitalistic reasons. The relationships between producers' organizations and slaughterers are strengthening because the producers' organizations encourage the sale of their pigs to some slaughterhouses with whom they have very regular relationship, and a very small number of French pigs go through the Marché du Port Breton, including for direct sales. There are many specifications, joint specifications between producers' organizations and slaughterers, and this encourages relationship between producers' organizations and slaughterers with an informal verticalization taking place. At the heart of the transactions between producers' organizations and slaughterers, there is an institution which serves as a marketplace called the Marché du Port Breton, the Breton market. Ever since 1972, it has organized sales and buying of pigs for both female and male pigs and serves as a reference for transactions in France. And the market has kept its function, although very few pigs are being sold there. Transaction prices are mainly indexed on the basis price, integrating the auction sale plus an added value. Contracts have been developing over the last few years, and contracted operations use other indicators such as the base price, for instance, the production cost. And these transactions account for less than 10% of pigs being sold in France, and usually concentrated in very specific specifications. Organic pig prices are decorrelated from the market. Very quickly, a few information on the other countries. In Denmark, market sales is verticalized with cooperatives, with the monopoly of Danish Crown with a reference price. In the US, both breeding and slaughtering are concentrated industries, and multiple trade circuits are available for sellers, but transactions and prices are monitored almost in real time. And in Quebec, marketing of pigs is collective and institutionalized. Breeders have grouped to fight the concentration of the slaughtering industry, and transaction modalities are fixed in a marketing contract or convention. The second part of my study was about finding a hierarchy of the free and competitive market and the vertical integration. In Germany, the market organization is very close to what we would call a free and competitive market. The dependence between buyers and sellers is limited. There are very few joint investments between the two, and exchanges between breeders and slaughterers are not very regular. The influence of the Vereinigungspreis is limited, and only breeders' representatives elaborate the price, and therefore it is not uniformly applied by the slaughterers. In Spain and the US, commercial dependence between buyers and sellers is limited. Integration and verticalization are acquiring more strength, and the players have become more dependent on the capitalistical level. The regularity of exchanges between buyers and sellers is moderate, and it depends on contracts. And in both countries, the reference quotes are representative and are very used for prices. In France, commercial dependence is very similar to what we have in Spain or in the US. Some producer organizations have capitalistic ties with the downstream sector, and they have made joint investments such as specifications. There is also some regularity in the exchange between producers and slaughterers, sometimes with contracts. The reference quote is elaborated by the Marché du Port Breton, by players active in the production and slaughtering business, but their representativeness in terms of market segment is not very high. The auction volumes are only a small part of the French and Breton market, but the quote is still followed by the other trade modes. In Denmark, the situation is almost monopolistic, with the Danish Crown Cooperative and reinforcing the dependence between buyers and sellers. The reference price is highly representative, and the Danish market is very close to what we would call an integrated vertical organization, where all the sales modalities are defined jointly without competition. Similarly, in Quebec, the pig market is very close to a verticalized organization. There is a marketing law for the pigs, which defines an almost total dependence between buyers and sellers, and the base quotation is negotiated upstream with all the players in the swine industry in Quebec. I would like to say that in the countries we have different ways to set the prices and also different ways to trade pigs. Every market illustrates the fact that they have their own original mechanisms to set the prices, partly due to progressive verticalization in the industry and the need for the players to dampen price volatility. In Quebec, Denmark, and Spain, pigs are sold in a very centralized way, contrary to the United States and Germany. In France, verticalization is important, and the Marché du Port Breton has lost volume, and this is a sign that the French industry is becoming verticalized. The marketplace will continue existing as a reference for most of the French transactions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pas mon micro. Merci beaucoup, Elisa. Je ne vois pas de questions dans le chat, Christine.
I don't see any questions, Christine. Let me know as soon as you have a question. But yes, what I find very striking regarding a kind of production which one might have thought would be homogeneous from one country to another versus other kinds of breeding industries. And I'm struck by the heterogeneity in the way the prices are set across these different countries. You held 12 interviews for each country. Did I get you well? Did I get that right? Your microphone is muted. Can you hear me? No, 12 interviews regarding the various markets. And based on the diversity we observed regarding marketing modalities, we found it was very difficult to meet experts who were capable of explaining quite clearly what was happening in each market. Well, at least your presentation was clear. You talked about trying to dampen down, mitigate the price volatility. Did you compare price volatility for pork meat based on these heterogeneous systems? Why is there more volatility mitigation in some countries rather than others? Well, we can talk about the US, for instance. I did not tell you this, but we found in the US that there are so many different ways, sometimes future markets, contracts, direct sales. And what we found in the US when we studied the market is that thanks to this diversity, a breeder is able to mitigate the risk of price volatility because he or she has many different things available, including the future markets in Chicago. Exactly. Exactly. Almost financial markets are applied here to pork meat marketing. The risk of price volatility is mitigated and reduced by these financial systems. I mean, we didn't look whether volatility had increased between a very specific period and another. Maybe that's something worth looking into. Now, the study we conducted was only conducted on 6 markets, but there are many other markets across the world, such as Italy, maybe the Netherlands. So we're going to keep the study alive. We will keep adding information, and maybe that would be an additional issue that we could look at to characterize every single market. Price volatility versus the preferred trading modes, marketing modes. Another question: in spite of verticalization, are there evolutions based on added value specifications, for instance, meat quality or animal welfare? I'm not sure that my answer will be fully satisfactory, but we don't have access to all the specifications. We did not really focus on every single item in the specifications. Well, I think we have something added to the question. What about marketing of pigs depending on whether they are castrated or not? Well, again, we focused on the standard type of pig. We did not discriminate. We did not look at quality or premium meat production, but or marketing. But if we looked at standard pig marketing modes, but there are other ways. For instance, the reference quote and how to choose this reference rather than another. There's one last question. Can we think that the Danish way with massive centralization and no competition gives us more power than the French system? Because in France, we are divided, which means we are more flexible, but again, we're not so powerful, we're weaker. Well, in France, I mean, there is a physical presence when you go to the Marché du Port Breton. So we have the breeders and the slaughterers both expressing themselves. And in the Marché du Port Breton, in the auction market, we find that payment, marketing, everything is very transparent. They have a charter at the MPB. And this is not true in Denmark. In Denmark, the cooperative decides. They say this is the price. And they have a reference quote, which they fix, they set internally in-house. We don't know with which mechanism there's no transparency and the breeders just have to accept the price set by the cooperative. In France, we also have a homogeneous classification system for the carcasses with a payment grid, which is applied for most pigs on the territory. And this is not true in Denmark. Yes, it is true. We did not talk about the tables, the grids for carcass classification. I'm sorry, but it's too late now. Again, I encourage anybody who would like to ask an additional question to contact you directly. We have to move on because we're running late. So thank you very much for your presentation. The next presentation, well, maybe he won't like it, but will be delivered by an old friend of mine, Peter van Ferneij. He's going to tell us about the pig industry becoming increasingly international in a situation which we thought would have encouraged autonomy. Peter, you have the floor.
Dans le cadre de notre observation continue de développement
Good afternoon. As part of our efforts to continuously monitor the growth of pig farming and trade around the world, we decided to take stock of the main developments. Many thanks to Boris Duflot for his contribution to this paper and to INAPOR for their financial support. In 2020, because of COVID-19 and because of the emergence of ASF, African swine flu, in Germany, there's even more uncertainty on the international swine market. However, despite these health concerns, swine trade broke new records in 2020 after several years of strong growth. Such growth is the result of a variety of different factors. Swine production has always undergone changes designed to improve national output or designed to gain market share abroad. As per the laws of competition, exporters who move into a foreign market usually cause a drop in local output there. This is due to higher competitiveness, availability of new breeding techniques, investments into the business. All of these factors lead to better performance. Change can also be the result of political will to either grow or curtail production with new constraints. ASF, or African swine flu, has spread through the whole of China since 2018, and this has caused Chinese output to plummet by 40 or 60%, depending on the source. These factors are causing increased participation in international trade, subject to export and import conditions. This year, COVID has disrupted international supply chains and heightened discussions on self-sufficiency and independence. Some say we have entered an era of deglobalization. No shortages of agricultural commodities have been reported in the European Union. However, faced with supply problems and/or a lack of outlets, businesses may adopt country-level strategies or international strategies. International swine trade is complex. Most countries around the world are involved, either as exporters or as importers. This map shows the largest trade flows, but does not show the huge quality differential between products. European Union countries, North American countries, that's Canada and the US, and South America, mostly Brazil, are the largest exporters in the world, and their main market is Asia. Up until recently, demand has favored processed goods. The goal is to maximize product variety based on destination. However, in recent years, the Chinese market has been looking for more basic cuts. Countries from the 3 leading exporting regions that I just listed gained even more market share in 2020. So who's in #1 position? The European Union, with over 5 million tons exported, all destinations and products combined. Followed by the USMCA, formerly called NAFTA. So that's the new United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement, which is also experiencing strong growth in exports. And lastly, South America, driven mostly by Brazil, who's a top exporter. So on this graph, you see that Spanish exports have skyrocketed, which made up for German exports, which plummeted in the second half of 2020 after the country was hit by ASF, African swine flu. Other leading European Union exporters include Denmark, the Netherlands, and France. The slide shows that the global production and trade landscape is subject to rapid change. Up until several years ago, Russia had a huge pig trade deficit. It depended on pig imports by over 1 million tons. After boosting output, thanks to government incentives, Russia turned things around and now exports more than it imports. Volumes are still low, and Russia exports mostly to neighboring nations, as well as Hong Kong and Vietnam. So clearly, Russia will claim its place as a net exporter in years to come. The international meat trade is dominated by China. Chinese imports went through the roof in 2020, reaching over 5 million tons. As a result, China accounts for 60% of all international imports, followed by other Asian countries. We can clearly see that the Russia-Ukraine-Belarus cluster has seen its imports shrink to almost nothing. Now, what's specific about China is that it imports mostly low value-added products, contrary to Japan. Japan prefers to import high-end products. On average, all products combined and all quality grades combined, Japan ranks #1 in terms of the average value of imports, although, as you can clearly see, the value of Chinese imports has surged. Now, there are 2 reasons for this. First, strong demand has caused prices to soar in China. And second, in addition to importing mostly offals, China recently started to import meats. China is striving to restore output to the pre-ASV levels of August 2018. China is making huge investments to revive output at the moment with strong government incentives. Until production is back to where it was, China has no choice but to import and try and make up for the shortfall and meet domestic demand. As I said before, China has a history of importing low value-added cuts such as offals and trimmings. However, over the past 2 years, the share of pork in imports has surged, as has the value added of imported cuts. Lard and processed products are currently not being imported. So on the right-hand side, you see a breakdown of pork cuts for the year 2020. So these cuts include deboned products, which are high value-added products. So deboned products require more work and account for 22% of imports. Over 50% of meat imports contain bones. So according to industry surveys, China likes to import half carcasses that can be divided into thirds, and the half carcasses are shipped to China's processing plants and are deboned there. Against the backdrop of constant supply and demand fluctuations, French businesses are adapting, both at home and internationally. Adaptation is necessary to seize opportunities or to work around constraints. Output is soaring in regions where commodities are readily available. Labor shortages, which is an issue mostly for Western European Union countries and for North American countries, labor shortages could trigger offshoring of production activities. In the face of environmental challenges, some businesses are also going abroad to keep growing. Faced with the risk of dwindling markets, companies may move to areas where market access is guaranteed. They may favor countries whose political environment is more favorable than last year's trade war between the US and China. Countries may look for more favorable health situations. They may look for countries with less red tape. Setting up shop in a protectionist country is a way to work around that country's protectionist agenda. Very few companies are actual global players. There are a few examples, however. Tony's Flesh is the leading meat packer in Germany, and since September, they have been forced to export through third countries, such as Denmark. So, from Denmark, they get to continue to serve their global customer base. Danish Crown. Danish Crown operates in several EU countries. They get to supply their own domestic market. They get to generate synergies in terms of commodities. And they get to generate a healthy bottom line even when a particular country is experiencing headwinds. Now, JBS is a Brazilian meat processor, and they operate on 3 different continents: South America, the US, and the UK since 2019, where they bought a Danish Crown's British affiliate, Tulip. So JBS can serve its domestic and international customers from 3 different continents. By way of conclusion, COVID-19 and African swine flu may further accelerate this market shift towards internationalization. Against this backdrop, pork trade is still very much part of the globalization era. Thank you for your attention.
Merci Anne-Peter. Bon, tu remets bien en exergue.
Jan, Peter, thank you for emphasizing the fact that the pork trade market, as is the case for other animal trade markets, completely depends on the health situation and health regulations. I'd like to remind you that the EU continues to ban the importation of Brazilian meat, pork meat. We also need to factor in the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, and there's been a lot of political changes in Russia as a result. So yes, the pork market is becoming more and more international, but much less so than other meats, such as poultry or meat. If we exclude trade between, or rather within the EU or within NAFTA, you need to bear in mind how much the trade of pork products represents. But there's another curve, there's another line that raises questions in my mind. What about other Southeast Asian countries? Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about these countries? These countries that are importing more and more pork products. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. If we factor out trade between, or rather within the EU or within NAFTA. Now, pig trade accounts for maybe 8 to 10% of global output. So it's limited, even though this is a huge thing for a number of importers or exporters. Now, trend, or rather trade, is on an upward trend, insofar as for more and more, we're dealing with countries that are low value added in our sector, and you can ascribe more value to them if you sell them elsewhere. Offals, for example. Consumption of offals in the EU is down, and the whole offals production is being exported to China and Asia. Now, China is a threat. China wants to restore pre-ASV production levels. So by definition, eventually, if we want to continue to export, we need to bear in mind that our volumes toward China are going to go down as they restore their own outputs. We need to find other outlets. We need to base ourselves on the existing data, but we also need to better map out trades between the different Asian countries. Thank you. I can see the organizers are telling us that we are behind schedule, and that's true. We're 15 minutes behind schedule. We have another question from Jean-Yves Madaké. I'll let you answer his question directly. Before the break, I would like to thank all of the speakers who presented in this session. Feel free to check out the poster room. Jan Peter has a poster there on logistics issues. In the course of this session, we looked at a variety of different topics. I strongly encourage you to read the papers. Because obviously the summaries that we're hearing in just 10 or 15 or 20 minutes simply cannot contain all of the information you will find in the papers. So feel free to watch the replay as well. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Bien, nous allons laisser quand même quelques minutes de pause.
We're going to enjoy a few minutes break, and we shall reconvene for the environmental session at 5 to 4. So we will start at 3:55. So many thanks to Christine and Philippe, as well as all of the panelists for taking part in the economy section of our program. My name is Francine De Quelen. I'm a research engineer at the INRAE-Pégase Joint Research Unit in Saint-Gilles. Today, I'd like to discuss a study on the use for fattening pigs of feeding strategies with a lower environmental impact. Animal production is associated with several environmental impacts, such as climate change, land use, or eutrophication. These impacts are connected to the production of feed, the use of non-renewable energy at the farm, and also gas emissions from feedlots, and also discharge management, slurry management. So feeding accounts between 65 and 95% of environmental impacts of pig farms. More specifically, 55 to 75% of the impact on climate change, 70 to 90% of the impact on energy usage, and 85 to 100% of the impact on land use. The usual method for formulating feed incorporates lower impact ingredients taking into account animal requirements and minimizing formulation costs. We will not look at the environmental impacts related to the production of ingredients. Some raw materials, such as imported soy meal, are high impact ingredients, whereas byproducts or some protein crops have a lower impact. Incorporating lower impact commodities in the feed seems to be an effective solution for improving sustainability of pig farms. The goal of this study is to test in rearing conditions the impact of this feeding strategy on the growth performance and on the environmental impact per kilo of pork produced using a life cycle analysis. As part of the study, we used a multi-objective approach to consider simultaneously the cost of commodities and also environmental impacts, such as climate change, non-renewable energy demand, land use, acidification, and eutrophication. The formulas take into account the requirements of growing pigs until they reach 65 kilos and of finishing pigs until they reach the slaughter weight of 115 kilos. We compared the 3 different feeding strategies. First, a control feed, which is typically used in the field, an eco feed using the multi-objective or multi-target approach, and a locally sourced feed, which is also based on the multi-target approach and incorporates ingredients produced on the farm or around the farm to reduce transport costs. This test was carried out at the UE3P, the Pig Physiology and Phenotyping Experimental Facility. So the test is comprised of a single repetition of 96 pigs, which were housed in a feedlot equipped with electronic smart feeders and an automated weighing system for continuous measuring of individual performance between 40 and 115 kilos. So indicators monitored including live weight and feed intake. So the ADG and the FCR are based on individual data recorded daily and automatically. At the end of the trial, the pigs were sent to a commercial slaughterhouse. We evaluated the environmental impacts of the pig fattening unit using life cycle analysis for each pig, taking into account individual growth performances. Now, the scope of calculation for the life cycle analysis includes feed production, pig rearing, slurry management for the fattening unit. Without factoring in piglet production, as a functional unit of measurement, we selected live weight gain per kilo. This table contains the feed formulas obtained as part of the project. For the growing phase, the feeds based on the multi-target approach have a lower grain and meal content and a higher proportion of grain byproducts and protein crops relative to the least cost feeds. We also see that within the meal category, soy meal is replaced by rapeseed meal in the least cost feeds. For the finishing phase, the different diets led to similar results. The share of grain is down with the multi-target approach, protein crops and byproducts are up, and the eco-feed and locally sourced feed do not use meals for finishing pigs. This table shows the environmental impact of feeds. For the growing phase, relative to the control feed, both the eco-feed and the local feed led to a reduction in the following impacts: climate change, energy demand, and acidification. No difference was observed for eutrophication. However, the eco-feed and local feed led to a higher impact on land use. Regarding the finishing phase, relative to the control feed, the eco-feed led to a reduction of all environmental impacts. The local feed reduced the following impacts: climate change, energy demand, and acidification. There's no change on the eutrophication front, and the land use impact has increased. If we compare the eco-feed and the local feed has a lower impact on non-renewable energy demand, but a higher impact on land use than the eco-feed. Compared with the least cost formula, the multi-target formula led to a reduction in the following impacts: climate change, non-renewable energy demand, and acidification. This formula barely affected the eutrophication impact, while increasing the impact on land use when the local feed is fed to growing and finishing pigs and the eco-feed is used on growing pigs. In terms of growth performance, measured between 40 and 113 kilos, there's no significant difference between the 3 experimental treatments regarding ADG, feed intake, FCR, and water usage. No significant difference observed in terms of carcass yield and lean meat percentage between the different treatments, which means that by and large, the feed formulas had no effect on growth performance. The environmental impact for the fattening unit was calculated while taking into account feed production, pig rearing, and slurry management. At the scale of the fattening unit, relative to the control feed, the eco-feed led to a reduction in the following impacts: climate change, energy demand, acidification, and eutrophication, but had no impact on land use. Under the same conditions, the local feed reduced the impacts on climate change and energy demand. It had no impact on acidification and eutrophication and led to a higher land use impact. The environmental benefits calculated at the fattening unit scale were similar to the benefits obtained at the feed scale. By way of conclusion, this study shows that formulating feeds with lower environmental impacts leads to reduced impacts per kilo of growing weight gain without altering growth performance. This feeding strategy requires additional measures so it can be rolled out at a larger scale. Two areas are important. Availability of protein crops can be improved by modifying crop rotation, and the price of byproducts could increase due to a higher demand, which would increase their environmental impact calculated based on economic allocation. Many thanks for your attention. This work received funding in the form of a credit incentive from the FACE Department of INRAE and support from the Apival Scientific Interest Grouping. Thank you very much, Francine, for this talk, which was extremely clear. No questions yet. Since the FCR differential was not significant between local and other formats, did you calculate the LCA using the same FCR value for all batches, or did you consider the 0.1 value for the local feed? Now, LCA calculations take into account the individual growth performance of the different animals. I assume that's the question. We did not use FCR. We used growth performance figures. Thank you for this presentation, says Anne-Sophie Valable. What is the extra cost between the different feeds? That's a very interesting question. Thank you for asking. It actually raised a number of questions in this project. There were no constraints. We thought that the raw materials were available in large quantities, so we found ourselves with a lot of ingredients. For example, protein crops, etc. So when I tried to calculate the cost of the feed, I talked to the FNCM organization, and the cost of feedstuffs of raw materials cannot be applied to the eco-feed formula because the actual cost, the feedstuff cost, cannot be assigned prospectively. But if we take into account the actual availability of feedstuffs, we find ourselves with an extra cost of about 2% for the eco-feed. So the question was, is the cost per kilo gain impacted? You've heard the answer. So the local formula tends to increase land use. And this may come as a paradox, but there's no benefit in terms of acidification or eutrophication, right? So do we know why we get the results that we get, particularly in terms of land use? As far as land use is concerned, if we dig deeper, well, I tried to dig deeper and I looked at the contribution of ingredients or commodities for each impact. As far as land use is concerned, this is tied to the high proportion of protein crops in the feed formulas. And this explains why the land use impact has deteriorated relative to the other impacts. Also, when calculation the formula, a different weight is assigned depending on the criterion. So eutrophication, acidification are two criteria for which the weight assigned is slightly less than for land use. We have another question. The MAT concentration of feed has not been modified with the environmental constraints. Shouldn't they be reduced because of these constraints? That's a decision we made. We made the choice not to modify the MAT to be able to compare the growth performance. We wanted to make sure we were dealing with equivalent levels of performance. So we used the same MAT levels. Now, in terms of the formulas, we can apply them using different constraints. And that could be interesting to do, to see whether or not this reduces, whether or not reducing MAT, whether or not it impacts, whether or not it has an impact on the environmental criteria. But basically, we're using the same levels of energy and the same levels of protein. Thank you very much. Perfect transition into the next talk. Many thanks, Francine. The next talk will look at the environmental upside of reducing the nitrogen concentration of diets. This is a presentation by Léa Cappelaere. So this is a meta-analysis type approach. Léa, you're on.
Bonjour, Léa Cappelaere, donc de chez Ajinomoto.
Good afternoon, Léa Cappelaere from Ajinomoto Animal Nutrition Europe. I'd like to share with you today a study we conducted within RAG regarding the meta-analysis quantification of the benefits of reducing dietary crude protein on nitrogen emissions of fattening pigs. Everybody knows that nitrogen emissions from pig farms are the main reasons for the impact on environmental impact, and therefore are controlled by the European legislation, regulation, for instance, the nitrate regulation, imposing constraints on the breeders, and also the breeders want to improve their environmental performances. In order to rise to the challenge, crude protein decrease plus amino acid supplementation is a good and acknowledged method to reduce nitrogen emissions, well documented in the literature. It's also acknowledged as being the best available technique by the European Commission. In order to work on the available knowledge, we conducted the meta-analysis in order to quantify in a robust fashion the benefits we could derive from decreasing crude protein contents on environmental impacts due to pig breeding farms. The publications we collected for the meta-analysis were published after 1990, and they looked into decreasing crude protein content in swine breeders regarding the manure, the gas emissions, and the studies were selected in such a way that the experimental diets were available so that we could perform a recalculation of the nutritional value of the feeds in order to compare the trials with a common basis. The trials were selected under digestible lysine levels so that we had stabilities between the treatments and we avoided biases, and the tolerance was minus 5% variation. The final base contained 30 articles, 43 trials, and 126 treatments. The parameters we took in consideration in the meta-analysis were treated in at least 10 trials in the base. Nitrogen balance, manure parameters such as nitrogen concentration, ammonia, nitrogen, pH and volume, and ammonia emissions, both in absolute values and relative values to the control. And the variables were the crude protein level, the fixed test effect and interaction test, and crude protein was kept if significant. Quadratic effect of the decreased crude protein content was considered as non-significant and therefore not kept. Prediction equations were performed in the meta-analysis. The general linear model was adopted as a predictor plus a fixed test effect. Now, let's look at the base constitution. We have two different types of trials or tests, long ones in groups and short ones. There was the statistical unit, two different tests. Growing pigs were more represented in terms of weight classes, but we have some trials with finishing pigs and 6 studies that covered the whole fattening period. 2/3 tested more than 2 crude protein levels so that we could test the linearity of relationship between the crude protein level and the response, and to include the quadratic effect of the crude protein level in the models. Regarding the experimental feed composition, the tested crude protein level ranged widely from current practices and slightly higher value, and minimum level went really low in terms of protein content. The crude protein content decrease was significant, between 3 and 6 points in the trials. The net energy level and digestible lysine levels are representative of the diversity of husbandry practices in Europe, as well as the cereals, 1/3 maize-based, 2/3 wheat or barley. The crude protein source in most trials was soybean meal. Results of the meta-analysis regarding the nitrogen balance first, no effect on retention was observed regarding the animal's growth. Basically, the ingested quantity was minus 4.3% per point of crude protein decrease, and the excretion was decreased by 8.2% per point of crude protein decrease. But there was no ceiling effect. The quadratic effect was not significant in this particular model. Now, interestingly, urinary excretion was impacted more than fecal excretion, minus 10% for excretion, urinary excretion versus 3% for fecal excretion. Urinary excretion decreased due to the reduction in the catabolism of excessive amino acid, due to the fact that the amino acid profile was more balanced in those diets with a low crude protein level, whereas fecal excretion is due to digestibility of nitrogen, which is quite stable in the low crude protein content diets, and therefore we only have here the effect of decreasing the ingested quantity. This allows to increase efficacy of nitrogen used by the animals, plus 1.6 point per point of decrease of crude protein content. Let's move on regarding nitrogen. And if we look at the slurry parameters, minus 2.8% volume per point of crude protein decrease, the nitrogen concentration decreases, and it makes sense, minus 5%. Ammonia nitrogen concentration, which is the most reactive type of nitrogen in the slurry, decreases by 7%. And we also have a 0.15% decrease of pH. Now, slurry volume decrease is due to the fact that less water was consumed and therefore less urine was emitted, with a decrease in urinary nitrogen excretion, and also a decrease in soybean inclusion in the low crude protein diet, meaning also a decrease in potassium inclusion due to the fact that there was decreased water consumption. Decrease in nitrogen concentration is directly linked to the decrease in nitrogen excretion, and the decreased ammonia concentration was due to the fact that slurry ammonia is directly derived from urea being degraded in the slurry, and there was a lesser urinary nitrogen excretion. Now, this is less pronounced than what we had seen on nitrogen excretion, because the lower slurry volume means that nitrogen was less diluted. Apart from the changes in the slurry composition, we also found that ammonia emissions were reduced by 10% per point of crude protein content decrease. There was no effect of the type of trial, both on the ammonia level emission, but also the reduction between metabolic cage trials and group trials, so we're closer to the practical conditions. And this allows us to formulate the assumption that our equation could be transferred to practical situations. Moreover, ammonia reductions were directly linked to urinary excretion with similar levels of reduction. And therefore, urinary excretion is a good predicting factor for ammonia and nitrogen and for ammonia emissions from slurry. Ammonia emission reduction allows to increase the part of nitrogen retained in the slurry. In order to predict the strategic effect of the crude protein content reduction on slurry, the part of ammonia and nitrogen over the total part is expressed linearly versus the excreted nitrogen. Based on the nitrogen efficacy, we can take in consideration both the effect on performances, but also the effect due to crude protein content decrease and also the weight class effect for the animals. Modeling ammonia emissions based on urinary excretion gives us a constant emission factor, showing that the model has an impact on the slurry composition and can be used with the existing emission factors. The model, therefore, allows us to take in consideration the protein content fed to the animal and the performance based on the slurry composition and the emissions that are directly connected. In conclusion, this meta-analysis provides a robust quantification of the effects of crude protein content decrease in pigs based on nitrogen excretion to predict the effects subsequently observed on slurry composition and ammonia emission. We also would like to suggest prediction equations which are easy to use with easily accessible data in order to perform an accurate model for strategies of crude protein content decrease on slurry composition and the subsequent emissions. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Léa.
Well, thank you, Léa. Could you please switch on your video as well as your microphone? There. We have a few questions already. Yes, we have two questions. Slurry pH decrease, can that be only explained by the electrolytic balance of the feed due to soybean, and the electrolytic balance, isn't it kept constant in parallel with the crude protein decrease? Well, yes, it can be explained by the decrease in the electrolytic balance. In most trials, there was a decrease in electrolytic balance due to crude protein decrease, so we could not test whether there was a pH effect and whether the balance would be maintained. Second question, how do you explain the decrease of ingested quantities per point of crude protein decrease? Well, it's not really a decrease in the total ingested quantity, but rather the nitrogen ingested. And even on this basis, we found an increase in the ingested quantity when we left the crude proteins and did not decrease them. I have another question while we wait for the next question from the audience. There are several studies showing that the fiber content in the diet also has an influence on how nitrogen is distributed between fecal excretion and urinary excretion in favor of ammonia being uptaken in the hindgut. Is this something that you looked at? Was there variability regarding the fiber content? No, we did not test that. In the studies, most of them, the vast majority, were based on cereals and soybean meal and no fibers. So the profiles were quite similar between the various trials. And we did not observe a decrease in the fiber content when we decreased the crude protein content. There was a graph showing ammonia emissions based on crude protein content. There seemed to be a linear relationship. But it looked like there were two populations, some with a low crude protein level and some with high ammonia levels. Is this due to the fact that the animals maybe had a different weight? Yes, absolutely. Were those studies where the ammonia levels were higher, focused on bigger animals, heavier animals, finishing pigs, whereas when there were some trials over the whole period, over the whole growth period, or the growing pigs. So if we use another expression, mode of expression, yes, I showed you the absolute value graph, but in the relative value, you will find that all populations are grouped together. So in the range of variation, very low crude proteins, we have heavier animals. So the range of variation is not the same depending on the weight. Is that what you're trying to convey? Absolutely. Now, regarding, no more questions. the use of references. If I remember well, most official methods to calculate ammonia emissions and nitrogen dispersal, especially for nitrogen peroxide and the impact on climate change, they consider the ratio ammonia nitrogen over total nitrogen, which is fixed. If I remember, we have 70% ammonia nitrogen. Yes, over total ammonia. Yes, that's it. So we would need to adjust the parameter when we change the diet, because otherwise it's at the expenses of part of the benefit. Yes, we lose part of the benefit if we use a fixed ammonia nitrogen share. Have you tried to look at what would happen? For instance, is there a risk of overestimating the ammonia emission for low crude protein content diets, according to the official method? No, we haven't done it, but it might be interesting to have a look at the differences, the numbers we would find if we apply models with a fixed ratio. What have you thought about? An international paper where this would be acknowledged by several institutions? Yes, it might be worth thinking about. Maybe Ludovic, you have a question? No more questions? No more questions. Well, I think you've actually covered almost everything. So we would like to have the same thing for wean piglets or gestating sows. Is that something, is it possible? Would there be food for thought? And for a paper? Well, for sows, I'm not really familiar with that, but for piglets, I thought about including them in the meta-analysis, but all it does is make the curves longer with animals which are slightly more efficient and excrete the lower ammonia emissions, so there would be less ammonia emissions. We would simply make the model longer, that's it. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this information, and we're going to move on to the next presentation, which will be delivered by Anne-Sophie Langlois. She's an engineer for the Chambre d'Agriculture de Bretagne.
Good afternoon. I would like to present you the latest information on acidification of liquid manure based on feedback from Northern European countries such as Denmark. Slurry acidification has grown for the past 30 years in Denmark, in line with domestic legislation, which gives pride of place to air quality. Liquid manure comes from cattle or pig farms, even digestate. In 2016, 20% of liquid manure in Denmark was acidified. The goal is to reduce the pH of slurry using acid, usually sulfuric acid, in order to shift the balance between NH4 plus ammonium in solution and gaseous NH3 ammonia toward the liquid NH4 plus form. This reduces nitrogen losses into the atmosphere. This technique is currently referenced in the farming brief as BAT, or best available technique. Slurry can be acidified at 3 different stages: storage in the building's pre-pit, storage in external pits, or during manure spreading operations. In 2016 in Denmark, 140 pre-pit acidification systems were in operation versus 75 external pit systems and 110 field-based systems. Now, building-based acidification system, as you can see on the diagram on the right-hand side, the slurry is pumped from the building's pre-pit into an external mixing tank. Acid is poured into the tank in quantities sufficient to reach the target pH, usually 5.5. Part of the acidified slurry is then redirected toward the building to reduce ammonia emissions as much as possible. The rest is pumped into an outside storage pit. The potential for reducing ammonia emissions ranges between 50 and 70% compared with a conventional storage system located under the feedlot. Gas emissions depend on the frequency of acidification, between 1 and 10 times a day. They also depend on slurry composition. Because the low pH inhibits methanogenic bacteria in the slurry, the process reduces methane emissions by nearly 50%. The impact on nitrous oxide, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, has not been clearly ascertained. Sources seem to disagree, maybe because nitrous oxide emissions are determined by a variety of factors. The impact on odors has not been studied extensively. The few studies available on the topic show different results. Regarding slurry composition, acidification increases the ammonia-nitrogen concentration, and that data point should be factored into the fertilization balance. Regarding building-based acidification costs, for an operation that produces 18,000 slaughtered pigs a year, the investment amounts to 250,000 euros. Labor costs, which are very low due to system automation, come to 4,100 euros a year. The dose of acid used ranges between 6 and 14 kilos per ton of slurry, depending on its composition and the farmer's reduction targets, which makes the cost of acid range between 7,500 and 17,500 euros per year. The energy requirement to operate the system is estimated at 3 kilowatt-hour per ton of slurry, and that's 3,200 euros a year. The spreading of a more acidic slurry can generate additional liming needs, the cost of which is estimated at 1,500 euros a year. This process is often implemented when building a new feedlot. The investment and operating costs then range between 14.8 and 15.4 euros per slaughter pig produced, or between 28 and 29.1 euros per cubic meter of slurry. Now, acidification at the storage pit. The slurry is often acidified when emptying the pit, so just before spreading. As a result, the reduction affects only field-based emissions. Mobile systems meet the needs of farming contractors who can provide the service to many customers. However, adding the acid causes foaming, so you need to plan for the extra volume in the pit. This technique is not suitable for covered tanks. Ammonia emissions are reduced by over 80% at spreading for a target pH under 6. In Denmark, end of storage acidification is performed by farming contractors, which means that there are no investment or maintenance costs for the farmer. The contractor then bills between 0.9 and 1.9 euros per cubic meter of slurry. So, third possibility, the slurry is acidified throughout the spreading process. It filters into the ground before the buffering capability can bring the pH back up, in which case you need a much higher pH target, usually set at 6.4. As a result, this particular system uses much less acid. There's a mixing system on top of the slurry tank, and the slurry is acidified just before going into the spreading lines, and the system is equipped with a pH sensor. The system can be set up on a wide range of tractors and slurry tanks and was designed in Denmark for use on drag hose spreaders. Acidification can reduce ammonia emissions by as much as 90% for a target pH of 6 compared with the traditional drag hose spreader system. Nitrous oxide emissions can vary on a case-by-case basis. Because there's less ammonia volatilization as a result of acidification, this limits random fallout in the field, which is rarely factored into the fertilization balance. And this also reduces the risk of increasing nitrogen residue at the start of the drainage period. When the lower ammonia volatilization is factored into the fertilization balance, the amount of slurry spread on the ground can be reduced to maintain constant stocks of nitrogen and to limit leaching risks. Because farmers can rent the system, investment, maintenance, and spreading costs are negligible. The total cost for farmers comes to 1.1 euros per cubic meter of slurry. The proportion of nitrate nitrogen bioavailable to plants can jump from 60 or 70% without acidification to 90% when the slurry has been acidified in the pre-pit. The amount of nitrogen absorbed by the crops does not change much as a result of acidification, maybe because nitrification of the nitrogen in the slurry and its absorption by the plants is delayed. Most of the tests we are looking at were based on limey soil. There's no effect on the soil pH. However, when the soil is already acidic, there may be an increased need for liming. Spraying sulfuric acid increases the sulfur content in the soil, and this input can exceed crop requirements by 50%. Therefore, there's a risk of sulfates leaching into the water table due to excess runoff during the drainage period. The sulfate input must be factored into the fertilization balance, particularly over several years. Spreading acidified slurry increases solubility of phosphorus and makes it more bioavailable, more available to plants. Conditions for implementation in France raise a number of issues. Firstly, there are safety risks. Storage of a strong acid raises safety concerns due to risks of explosion, and this could deter farmers from adopting the technique. Liming requirements are worth looking into, particularly in Brittany, where soil is already acidic. The reduced methane emissions and the potential for extra liming needs raise questions regarding the carbon balance of this technique. The impact on soil biodiversity, which has been the subject of very little research, should be studied further. So all of these safety and biodiversity issues and the use of a strong acid are raising questions regarding the technique's societal impact. The environmental cost-benefit ratio of building-based acidification should be quantified throughout the discharge management continuum, considering the heavy investment that this represents. The cost-benefit ratio should be compared to that of other techniques for reducing in-building ammonia emissions laid down in the farming brief. The goal is to give breeders the best guidance on which solution is most suitable for reducing in-building ammonia emissions. Acidifying the slurry at the end of the storage period requires extra tank capacity, which rarely dovetails with existing storage facilities. The technique does not work when the pit is already covered, in which case it's easier to acidify the slurry during spreading operations. And this explains why this type of acidification is less popular in Denmark than the other two techniques. In-field acidification seems more beneficial, particularly when weather conditions are favorable. This means reduced emissions, and the ammonia that does not get released into the atmosphere is available for the crops. Acidification is an interesting technique for reducing ammonia emissions, whether in building, in storage, or in field. However, there are safety, environmental, economic, and sociological concerns. This review shows that additional studies are necessary in order to better ascertain feasibility in our country. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, and Sophie, for sticking to the time limit. We have 4 or 5 minutes left for questions and answers. We have 2 questions that have come in. What is the impact of slurry acidification if you use it for methanation? Good afternoon, everyone. Let me try and answer question number 1. I don't know exactly what the question means. Are you referring to the spreading of acidified digestate during the spreading operations? Or there's a number of studies on the topic. Because the pH of the digestate is higher than that of traditional slurry, you need more nitrogen to reach the target pH of 6.4. Conversely, the benefits in terms of reduced ammonia emissions and also the nitrate and nitrogen available for plants, that varies quite a bit relative to a traditional raw slurry. Regarding the cost-benefit ratio, I don't know. That's something that's missing. But based on the preliminary results, when you acidify digestates in the middle of spreading operations, this can bring higher benefits than using a traditional raw slurry. Another possibility would be to perform the acidification throughout the fatting period, so at the building level. So the slurry has already been acidified before it gets to the methanizer. But there's even less literature available on this topic. The only studies available said that when you add acidified slurry to the digestate, increases biogas output until you reach an incorporation rate of 30% inside the digester. That's pretty much the only data point we have on this topic. I hope that answers your question. Thank you. I think you have. Now, regarding this conversation on the cost-benefit ratio, most farms today come under constraints in terms of nitrogen volumes, which means that it is in their interest to avoid the releases of nitrogen to the atmosphere, because otherwise they're going to have to compensate with fertilizers and entrants or inputs. Yeah, that's the goal at the end of the day. Acidification helps better manage nitrogen insofar as there are fewer nitrogen emissions, which means there's less nitrogen fallout, while the fallout is much more random. And the nitrogen fallout is random and therefore not factored in to the fertilization balance. But so you don't have any data regarding the lower use of fertilizers or inputs that can result from that? I guess a lot of factors come into play. The weather, for example. Now, the cost-benefit ratio varies quite a bit. It can be a negative ratio. It can be extremely negative if the baseline weather conditions don't allow for volatilization of ammonia, in which case the spreading costs and acidification costs may outweigh the benefits in terms of saving on fertilizers. But obviously, it all depends on the weather conditions and crop requirements. There's really no straightforward answer. We're hoping to explore that further in Brittany. Other questions have come in? Yes, we have a quick question calling for a quick answer. Maybe it's been answered already, but which strong acids are being used, please? Well, in the vast majority of cases, sulfuric acid. Denmark uses mostly sulfuric acid because it provides the best cost-benefit ratio at the end of the day. So that's the acid that's the most used, and there are other acids that can be used sometimes. HCl, hydrochloric acid. Now, hydrochloric acid releases chloride ions, which are extremely corrosive, particularly for all of the equipment and the storage facilities. Nitric acid is another possibility. However, nitric acid enters into a reaction with organic materials, and this releases nitrogen into the atmosphere. So we're trying to reduce nitrogen losses, so I guess it defeats the purpose. So phosphoric acid is another possibility, but that means additional phosphate inputs into the ground. And we need proper phosphorus management in order to reduce losses and reduce eutrophication. So in terms of strong acids, it's mostly sulfuric acid that is used most of the time. I can see two other questions have come in, but because the clock is ticking, I'm going to ask Anne-Sophie Langlois to please answer them directly in the chat box. Donc, merci en tout cas. Many thanks to Anne-Sophie Langlois. Without further ado, we're going to hear the next talk by Christophe Perrot from the Agroecology INRAE Research Unit in Dijon. His work raises an issue that has been little explored the impact on soil microbiology of the effluent spreading practices of mixed cattle pig farms in grassland areas of the Massif Central region in France. Here you go. Good afternoon, one and all. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Obviously not physically, but virtually. I am very happy because it's been a while since I last attended the GRP Swine Research Seminar. So I'm delighted that my paper has been selected and I get to talk to you about our work. Our work is unusual for GRP talks, but we will discuss soil microbial ecology, and as you will see, this can prove relevant in swine research. My name is Christophe Perrot. I am currently a postdoc student at INRAE in Dijon. I'm part of the biocom team of the agroecology joint research unit, and my supervisor is Sophie Sadé-Bouchetot. And together we try to answer the following question. What is the impact of soil microbiology on the effluent spreading practices of mixed cattle pig farms and grassland areas of the Massif Central region of France? My work is part of a multidisciplinary research project called APORTE, A-P-O-R-T-H-E, which stands for showcasing the benefits of pig-cattle complementarity in grassland areas of the Massif Central region. So on the slide, you see a couple of statistics regarding the Massif Central region. For example, the total surface area of this region is bigger than Portugal and Ireland combined. So a total surface area, 85,000 square kilometers. 60% of municipalities are located in mountainous areas, and 85% of the cropland is grassland, and we have about 1,000 pig farms, most of which also raise cattle. So pig farms. Raising pigs on a mixed farm brings many benefits because pigs eat grain and byproducts, which supports the production and use of local resources. Pig slurry is a natural fertilizer, which reduces reliance on synthetic fertilizers and has an impact on soil microbiology. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. So pig farming is a side business which encourages young farmers to set up shop without having to expand their footprint. And lastly, locally reared pigs are sold on local markets, which supports the local economy, local slaughterhouses. So our main question is this: does soil microbiology make it possible to characterize the impact of manure spreading practices of mixed pig cattle farms in grassland areas of the Massif Central region? That's a mouthful. Now, materials and methods. I'd like to introduce to you our strategy for sampling the farms. On the left-hand side, you see a map of the region. We have selected 40 mixed pig cattle farms located in 4 different areas of interest, and the farms are spread evenly in Allier, Aveyron, Corrèze, and Haute-Loire. So for each farm, we took 3 soil samples from fields where existing manure spreading techniques are used to ensure representativeness. So 3 composite soil samples, each comprised of 5 cores. So that's what you see in the red circle. So this means a total of 120 samples, including 3 replicas per farm. Now, in addition, by the way, this part of the work was done mostly by Florian, Catherine, and Sylvie. So in addition, we tried to create a typology of the farms using semi-directed surveys carried out in the fall of 2019. We were able to collect information regarding the field organization, crop rotation, animal feeding, grazing methods, types of manure, etc. So we were able to create variables to describe manure management practices and create a typology. So in total, the farms were tiered into 3 different groups. You can see the summary on the screen. We focused mainly on total nitrogen because it's representative of other effluents. We also looked at grazing pressure. So on average, 160 kilos per hectare of total nitrogen output with significant grazing pressure. So for group 2, the total nitrogen input is higher, but grazing pressure is 50% less. Group 3 is more conservative with lower total nitrogen input and grazing pressure on a par with group 2. So microbiological indicators, there are 3 of them, including MMB, microbial molecular biomass, to estimate the total abundance of soil microorganisms. That way we measure the total DNA amount using a fluorescence assay. We have a second indicator, a microbial balance, or FB ratio. That's the fungal to bacteria biomass ratio. That way we observe a potential imbalance. I'll get back to that when we discuss the results. And we quantified the fungi and bacteria using quantitative PCR and DNA extraction. The third indicator is microbial diversity. It's used to determine taxon richness. But we also try to determine community structure, and we try to name the different taxa. So for that purpose, we carried out very high throughput mass sequencing of extracted DNA. Now, regarding the physical and chemical properties of the soil, on the left-hand side, you see the soil texture triangle where we positioned the 42 different farms. As you can see, the distribution is uneven. 80% of the farms are tiered into 3 different groups. So silty, silty sandy, and silty clay sandy. In terms of soil chemistry, we observe a gradient for total nitrogen and organic matter concentrations. And there's a significant difference between groups 1 and 3. Group 2 is significantly different than the other groups. It has a higher concentration in available phosphorus. Now, our results regarding MMB, microbial molecular biomass. Group 1 has the lowest MMB in micrograms of soil. Group 3 has the highest MMB, and the lower the total nitrogen input, the higher the MMB. The loss of biomass in group 3 could stem from a long-standing history of using inputs. So repetition and quality of inputs are important. Other potential reasons include variable grassland management strategies. Indeed, farms in group 1 overwhelmingly use mowing and grazing practices, and more intensive management and the export of plant biomass does not allow for a stimulation of soil MMB. Lastly, grazing. Grazing is much more intense in group 1. 765 livestock units per day per hectare, and half of that for group 2 and group 3. Which could result in a lower carbon concentration and therefore biomass in the soil. Now, regarding microbial balance or F2B ratio, fungal to bacteria biomass ratio, as you can see, group 2 has the highest ratio. Groups 1 and 3 have significantly lower ratios, but by and large for all 3 groups, there's a good microbial balance between 1 and 5%, and group 2 has a slight tendency to favor fungi. And fungi are known to have a more complete enzymatic arsenal for degrading more recalcitrant materials. It is possible that group 2 farms may apply effluents containing a larger proportion of manure compared to slurry, which is more difficult to break down. Now, results regarding microbial diversity. I'm using box plots here. On the left-hand side, you find the prokaryotes, the prokaryotic organisms, which include bacteria and archaebacteria. So we represent the number of OTUs, the operational taxonomic units. Actually, this represents a number of species. So whether for our key bacteria or fungi, there's no significant difference between the different groups. By way of conclusion, it's the first time we've been able to study the impact of slurry spreading practices for mixed pig cattle farms in grassland areas of the Massif Central region on the microbiological quality of soils, thanks in particular to metabar coating approaches, which are increasingly popular. It would seem that a more virtuous practice that is extensive, with fewer inputs, whether slurry or synthetic fertilizers, and lower grazing pressure induces a significant increase in microbial mass. In terms of prospects, we started doing it, but there's no time to discuss it today. But we started to perform partition of variance analyses to determine the weights of the different slurry management variables and environmental parameters impacting the various microbiological indicators. We also started analyzing microbial and taxonomic structures and making functional inferences to predict the functions and potentials of those microorganisms. Obviously, we're focusing on the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. We also assigned ecological traits. I'm referring to trophic types. For example, determined the breakdown between pathogenic, symbiotic, and saprophytic microorganisms. I'm showing you the pictures of the people I wish to thank, since we're meeting virtually and they could not be here in person. So these are all of the individuals who participated in the project, including our partners and our financial backers, of course. If you have any questions, I am on hand. And if you'd like to write me, you will find our 2 email addresses in the lower left-hand corner. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christophe, for this presentation. And we have a couple of minutes for Q&A.
J'ai le son qui est revenu. Donc, une question qui demande...
Excusez-moi, j'avais oublié de mettre mon micro.
Apologies, I forgot to turn on my microphone. Did you obtain cores? I'm sorry, I answered live. And the answer was yes. We took cores to check the depth of the soil. Second question, the spreading of pig and cattle excretion or slurry, did that improve the fodder yield in grassland? You deactivated your microphone. We can't hear you, Christopher. Oops. Somebody muted me because I didn't touch my keyboard, so somebody must have muted me. Okay, that's a tough one. And maybe other project participants can have a better answer. That's not something we looked at. That's definitely something we can explore further next time. I have a question regarding the quantities of nitrogen. The quantities of nitrogen spread. Are we factoring in only the manure and liquid manure, or also the dejecta from grazing animals? Same thing. Somebody can mute me or answer in my place. Only the volumes spread. So to do the math, we use the coefficient. The coefficients available to the sector to obtain the equivalent of a total nitrogen volume. So does that mean a high fertilization rate? Do we stand above the standard, which is 270 kilos per hectare? So we're talking intensive fertilization practices. I think it's borderline. I guess it all depends on the farm. 125, 160, and 180. Those were the values. Now, for some farms, it worked. On average, 180, that could have worked. Now, obviously, that's above my pay grade. At the end of the day, how does this compare with other systems? I assume that in the same region, there are other areas where the main crop is grain. What's the level of diversity? How different is it from grain farms? Well, we don't have a repository in terms of spreading techniques. We don't know. My team focuses more on soil issues. So we do have data on soil depending on the type of usage. So forests, large crops, vineyards, grassland. And we have indicators for each. And that gives us some idea of microbial diversity, whether in terms of biomass or fungal or bacterial volumes. We have some idea of the taxonomic richness, quote unquote. But we need to bear in mind that these are systems that are very different from each other. Okay. I just wanted to know, we often hear that permanent grasslands are better for biodiversity. Is this borne out by your research? It's a tricky one. In our repository, we do have grasslands, meadows, but this may not necessarily include a sample that has been spread. So it's possible to make comparisons, but variance analyses are more sophisticated statistics in order to iron out some of the parameters. Okay, thank you very much. That means we have a date and you'll come back next year and tell us more about your results. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much. Okay, next talk by Nadine Guingamp. She's an engineer at IFEP and she will look at air quality issues, particle or ammonia emissions.
Particulate matter in swine farms, a way to explore reducing nitrogen losses by pig farming in France. TSP PM10 and PM2.5 in field conditions. Nadine Guingamp, Solène Lagadeg, Melinda Assouna in Ray, and Laure Boulestré from the Chambre régionale d'agriculture Pays de la Loire. With less than 1% of national emissions of particulate matter, the swine industry is a small contributor. Analyzing literature shows a large disparity between the emission factors. This is explained through the diversity of the technical patterns used for farms. Based on these two observations, the Papovid project funded by IFIP with many other partners was initiated. The first part of the project was dedicated to finding a method to measure the particles while using the national production conditions. The measurement methods were published during the 52nd edition of the IFIP seminar. The second part was to apply these methods to farms based on the various technical patterns, and that will be what I will be focusing on today. The study concerned 28 fattening rooms from farms in the western part of France, selected according to the way they fed the animals, dry feed or liquid feed, and also based on how they managed the effluents, pit storage versus scraping. The airflow had an importance on particle suspension, and therefore we took weather conditions in consideration. For each room, measurements were conducted during two different periods, the cold period and the warm period. For each room in each period, 3 measurement campaigns were initiated, taking into consideration the time during which the animals were in the rooms. First campaign between 14 and 18 days of fattening, 45 and 50 days, and the third between 78 and 82 days. During each measurement campaign, more than 30 parameters were measured or recorded. regarding the environment, the animal performance, the technical specific features of the rooms, and the particle concentrations. Material and methods, all the measurement equipment was placed in the center of the corridor, measured at 1 meter from the ground for 24 hours. Airflow calculation was made from concentration, CO2 concentration measurements every 5 minutes. Temperature and hygrometric values were obtained from a probe recording every 5 minutes. Particle concentration, mass, and number for TSP, PM10, and PM25 was measured with an optical counter, and the measurements, the readings were done every minute for 24 hours. In parallel to the OT measurement, a gravimetric filtration measurement was performed in order to measure the mass concentration of TSP to compare it with the value read by the optic sensor. Results. The cold period was a temperature, external temperature of about 9 degrees and almost 19 degrees for the warm period. For the cold period, the temperature inside the building was 24 and 25 for the hot period, and the airflow for the cold period was 18 cubic meters versus 43 for the warm period. The ambient temperature and airflow values were in accordance with the recommendations. Statistical comparison showed a statistically significant difference between the 2 periods for all 3 parameters. Data analysis was performed taking in consideration the period effect. Period effect on particles is illustrated with this first series of results. Mass concentration, particle concentrations are higher for all fractions in the cold period. Now, the difference is only significant for PM10 and PM25. Airflow reduction during the cold period leads to a minor evacuation of the particles towards the outside of the building, and therefore concentration indoors increases. Emission calculation based on the product between concentration and flow reaches the opposite conclusion. The flow difference between the periods is higher than the concentration difference, which means that we have an increase of particle emissions towards the atmosphere during the hot warm period. And the difference here is statistically significant for all 3 fractions. Regarding number concentrations, there is no period effect. Concentration indoors are equivalent between the warm and the cold period for all 3 fractions. Emission data show a significant period effect with atmosphere emissions higher during the warm period for all 3 fractions. Again, this is due to the gap between the airflow in the 2 periods. Concentration and mass concentration data are in accordance with the literature data. However, it is not possible to make a comparison for concentration and number emissions because we didn't have any bibliography reference to work with. 3 measurement campaigns were done for all 3 batches in order to integrate the weight in the calculation. The mass concentration for particles increases as the campaigns move on. The campaign effect is only significant during the cold period. Same result obtained for number concentrations. This is due to the fact that the animals' weight increased, but also the quantity of feed distributed change. The limited flow relationship between the beginning and the end of fattening during the cold period explains why the mass concentration is pronounced and not mitigated by the airflow increase. Now let's look at the impact of the way the animals were fed on particle concentrations. 2 methods are compared: dry feed in the form of pellets versus liquid feed in the form of liquid soup. In our study, no statistically significant effect of the way the animals were fed was shown for both seasons and all 3 fractions of particles, be it for mass concentration, but also for number concentration and emissions as well. In the literature, we find a reduction in the mass concentration for particles when the animals are fed a liquid soup. However, in the study we looked at, the feed was distributed in the form of flour and not pellets. Absence of feeding method can be due to the composition and especially the fat intake. This parameter was not yet integrated to the analysis. So 2 different ways to manage effluents: pit storage versus scraping. And in our study, the scraping systems showed mass concentration and number concentration lower than those rooms where the effluents were stored in a pit. However, this is only significant for the mass concentration. A study from the Chambre d'Agriculture de Bretagne showed a TSP concentration level always lower in the scraping premises rather than the pit storage premises. In some studies, there is an importance on the particles, and frequent evacuation, removal of the slurry influences the possible production of a particle. In our study, the particle concentration in the scraping premises was minus 21 to 37% according to the fractions. Combining the feed plus the effluent management or disposal shows a reduction in particle concentrations, both in mass and numbers, for both periods where the animals were fed as liquid feed and where the effluents were disposed with scraping. According to the fraction, this will vary between minus 30 to minus 58%. One of the originalities of the study is based on the particles being measured both in mass and number. If we analyze the mass concentration profile in our sample, we find that PM10 represent 50% of the suspension particles. The remaining 50% are particles with a size in excess of 10 microns. The same analysis regarding number concentration shows that PM25 and PM10 account for the particles mostly present in the room, with 94% and 99% of the TSPs represented by these two particles, and particles in bigger than 10 microns only represent 1%. Concentration profiles were also analyzed based on the technical management methods, and no significant difference was identified. In conclusion, this study showed us to apply with field conditions the measurement methodology applied during the first part of the Papovits project. We therefore established the first emission fraction for all three fractions of particles, TSP, PM10, PM25, for technical management patterns which are representative of our national production conditions. Our sample also showed us the effect that the feeding method and the effluent disposal methods have in order to find techniques that will release less particles, and this is found to be the case with liquid feed combined with scraping effluent disposal methods. Thank you very much for your presentation, Nadine. Very nicely illustrated. Not easy because so many factors were being taken in consideration. We don't have any questions yet, not yet. I have a question. What I find striking is that the whole particle issue really addresses two questions: health issues for the workers and also possibly the animals if there are high particle concentrations in the premises, and also the flow of particles in the environment, the emissions into the environment. And we find that it's difficult to deal with both questions simultaneously, because when there is weak ventilation, obviously the quality of air will be degraded for both workers and animals, but you reduce the emissions towards the environment and the other way around. Sometimes when air quality is good inside the building, then obviously it means that you have released more particles towards the atmosphere. So how can you find a compromise? Hello, everybody again. The solution lies in reducing the generation of particles, produce less particles, because once the particles have been generated, either you keep them inside with a low flow of ventilation, and that obviously is not very good for the people working in the farm, or you release them towards the outside, and that's bad for the atmosphere. So we have to find ways to actually generate less particles. And that's what we have observed. When we dispose of the effluents with a scraping method, because we generate less particles by scraping rather than storage in a pit. But this gives rise to another ambiguity. In the regulations, We have mass values that we should not exceed, thresholds expressed in milligrams per cubic meter. I mean, that's true for any kind of atmospheric pollution, including, for instance, when cars are no longer allowed to be driven when we reach too high a level of air pollution. This is based on mass concentration measurement, whereas it's actually the size of the particles that really has an impact on people's health. So there are ambiguities here at play, especially regarding particles. And these effects were of the same amplitude for 2.5 particles versus the others? Well, that's what I was attempting to convey in one of my last slides. There is no difference. We don't observe any significant difference between the various technical management patterns. Now, this measurement method was adjusted to the French working conditions or production conditions. However, there seems to be variability between the farms regarding a number of parameters. For instance, the way the animals are fed, liquid versus dry feed. And we believe that the feed composition, for instance, the fat content, which acts as a binding agent in the feed, would have an impact on particle emission. And that was difficult to try and integrate this kind of variability regarding parameters which are well known and well controlled. Yes, there are questions now being posted. Two questions which are in a way associated: the impact of the way the animals are fed, liquid feed versus dry feed. Liquid feed limits the particle generation, and there's also the pneumatic effect for the way the feed is distributed, and also the difference between the quantity of particles coming from the feed itself or from the distribution, the mode of distribution. Well, our sample did not allow us to show this quite clearly, but I guess that depending on the pressure exerted on the feed when it is pushed towards the trough to be fed to the animals, I guess that if the pressure is very high, the pellets will be broken and this will release dust. So the way the feed is distributed may generate dust. And this is likely, but not found anywhere in the literature. And again, our sample was did not include enough variability parameters so that we could include this effect, but it's more than likely that this is happening. And the second question, the relationship between, or rather, can we tie the quantity of particles coming from the feed to the way the feed is being distributed, with the way the feed is being distributed? Well, when we measure particles, we take the particles as a whole, regardless of their origin. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to discriminate between the particles coming from the feed itself, from the animals, from the effluents. You'd have to do electron microscopy examinations to find exactly where they come from. Generally speaking, in the literature, we know that the main source is the feed, if the feed is dry. However, this is the way the feed is distributed is not really developed in the literature as far as liquid feed is concerned. And that would be a good sequel to our project. I see that there are two more questions regarding the rules for labor and odor emission, but I suggest that you reply to those questions in the Q&A chat function, because otherwise we're going to run out of time. We move on to the last presentation. Pierre Ledévéat will be the speaker from the Chambre d'Agriculture de Bretagne regarding implementation of the TARA tool to size and optimize the air scrubber operation. Good afternoon. I would like to show you how we designed the TARA tool to size and optimize air scrubbers. In some farms are equipped with an air scrubber to reduce ammonia emissions and also odors and smell and dust emissions. Trouble is that a 2015 study showed that the efficacy of these scrubbers ranged from 17 to 70%, which means that we need more data to find the right size for the air scrubbers. And in order to meet this need, the project allowed us to find an Excel tool to optimize the design of the next scrubbers and also optimize the existing ones. And so in order to understand how we came up with this TARA tool, we have to understand first what an air scrubber is. Air from the building is brought to a duct towards the air scrubber. So it's a specific air scrubber for this kind of ventilation. Here you see the fans from the ventilation duct bringing the air towards the scrubber. The scrubber is made of different elements. There is a packing that allows contact between the air and the scrubber, in which a biofilm develops which contains the right bacteria to degrade the air. There is a sprinkling rail, and at the bottom there is a tank, which in French we call the swimming pool. And the sprinkler works as a closed circuit, accumulating nitrogen in water. And there is also a mist droplet separator on top of the packing to limit water losses. The air coming from the pig pen comes through the packing, goes through the packing. Ammonia is solubilized in the water in the packing and moves from the gaseous form to the liquid form. And then the tank will be loaded with ammonia ions, which will be oxidated thanks to the bacteria present within the package. The packing, this leads to increase in ammonia and nitrogen in the water, and water conductivity increases, leading to reduced capacity for the water to solubilize the waste. In order to size the air scrubber appropriately, several parameters are to be factored in. They are determined by physics law regarding the balance between the size of the packing and the quantity of water. We size the flow, the water flow, minimum flow needed for NH3 to be treated without allowing for excessive pumping. Then we size the packing itself so that it provides a sufficient contact, gas-air contact, to solubilize the ammonia while allowing the water to flow through the packing. On top of the sizing, we also have to have a measurement tool to check that the scrubber is operating appropriately. And electric conductivity is the indicator of scrubbing quality. It's directly linked with the nitrogen concentration in the scrubbing water. If conductivity increases, it means that the scrubber is operating appropriately. Field measurements showed that efficacy drops when we exceed 40 millisiemens per centimeter. And therefore, electrical conductivity is interesting for two reasons. It shows that the scrubber is operating appropriately, and it also tells you when to clean the tank. TARA was designed based on equations regarding the physical water absorption and the field measurements. The tool is both dynamic and visual. Changes in the input parameters has an impact on the output values as illustrated with a graph. And we want to optimize the new scrubber project as well as optimize existing scrubbers. Two modules, one for sizing, for new projects of new scrubbers, and operating module to optimize existing and already operating scrubbers. In order to use the sizing module, we have to enter the values imposed by the premises themselves, characteristics of the air to be scrubbed, temperature, relative moisture, maximum flow, and NH3 concentration. Next, we have to provide the characteristics of the scrubbing water, temperature, the volume of the tank, the sprinkling flow, and the conductivity threshold requested, and finally the packing characteristics, type of packing, model, and height. Based on all these data, values with an order of magnitude allow the user to know what to enter exactly. For instance, here the sizing module will give the characteristics of the incoming and outgoing water, the volume and size of the packing, the necessary volume for the tank, the characteristics regarding scrubbing water, the scrubbing water flow, the number of nozzles for sprinkling, and finally the efficacy of the sized scrubber. Next, we can vary the sizing parameters in order to achieve the expected results. The operating module requires more or less the same information, with this exception. These measurements are not theoretical, and these values are not theoretical, and they can be controlled with measurements. Characteristics such as packing size, for instance, or tank volume cannot be changed because the scrubber is already operating. The the operating module will give the characteristics of the scrubber, the air, the incoming air with the nitrogen load, all the informations that are representative of the scrubber's efficacy, the scrubbing water characteristics, quantity of saturated NH3 saturated water to be disposed of, how often we need to dispose of the water, the quantity of nitrogen fixed by the scrubber every year, and the final quantity of nitrogen released by the whole building, thanks to the scrubber. We can then look at how to improve the described scrubber by playing around with the incoming and outgoing data, input and output data, such as the size of the packing or the sprinkling volume and flow. In the end, the tool will be efficient to find the right size for air scrubbers, new air scrubbers, and optimize the operation of existing air scrubbers. It also helps assess the water consumption and identify the levers for actions that will allow to improve the efficacy on ammonia. It also helps determine the quantity of ammonia released after air scrubbing and the quantity that will be fixated in the bound in the scrubbing water. In order to obtain this tool, all you have to do is send an email to Solène Lagadec at the Chambre d'Agriculture de Bretagne or Nadine Guingamp at IFIP. And both their emails addresses are available on the website, and the guide will be delivered, the tool will be delivered with a guide regarding its operation and a handbook. Thank you, Pierre, for this presentation. No questions yet. So please send your questions. I would like to start with one question. In some countries, they have acid air scrubbers. Is this model also adapted or would it need to be different? The tank is not always easy to access. And the point with this particular scrubber is that the pH is self-regulated by the bacteria. At the beginning, when the scrubber starts operating, pH values go up. But as soon as the bacteria start working, they will lower the pH. So this will increase ammonia uptake. Absolutely. I have a question regarding the tool and how you use it, because obviously you have to think about the users. I guess that in the parameters to be used and the number of parameters, you have thought about how easy it is to find these parameters, whether the users are familiar with those parameters. Well, on the tool, you will find indications regarding that will provide you an order of magnitude. If you don't really know the order of magnitude, there will be order of magnitudes to help you. For instance, the temperature in the premises or that kind of parameter, you will get an order of magnitude to guide you. There's another question. Can we put bacteria in the air scrubber to have the right flora? Well, it will happen naturally. It will take a few weeks initially, but what we have observed on the field is that the first time you start using the scrubber, when it's brand new, it will take up to 1 month for the bacteria, for the biofilm to develop and the bacteria to become active and start doing their job. But what we recommend is that users try not to wash the packing because the bacteria are in the packing. So if you clean the system, don't wash the packing because it will become active more quickly the second time if the packing still has its bacteria inside. Well, the point here is the point of your model is that it seems to do a closed circuit. It's a loop with the nitrogen level. You also measure the N2O levels. Yes, that's part of it. That's part of the parameters, the information that we find the output. But if we take the farm altogether, does it make a difference in terms of greenhouse gas effect emissions? Greenhouse effect gases emission? Well, for the outgoing air, up to 70% of the nitrogen will be cleaned out of the air, but I wouldn't know what that really means in terms of whole farm. But you know, nitrogen peroxide is very strong greenhouse effect gas, so even a small quantity might make a difference. Well, it's really nice that your tool will help you assess all these levels. People are growing tired. Here we're talking about air scrubbing to remove ammonia, but do you have any information regarding the efficacy on, for instance, particles? No. No, the tool doesn't provide that kind of information. At least, at any rate, our study did not focus on other things such as particles. Maybe you could do it in the next version. Maybe, yes, that would be another project. Okay, if there are no more questions, this means that we have reached the end of this session. I'd like to thank the various speakers and also their co-authors because they also have contributed. I would like to thank the audience for the many questions you have posted and for the interesting Q&A sessions. The environment for the last 15 years has been at the very heart of our sessions and this seminar because there is a stronger expectation from society regarding environment. Initially, people worried about nitrogen emissions due to the nitrate directive, but progressively there were other issues such as gas emissions, particle emissions, smell, and also environmental impact assessment through the life cycle. And this year, we focused on a different topic regarding the impact, either positive or negative, of effluence on soil or land quality and also biodiversity. For the future, I guess that we will continue working on this subject, and for the next editions, we might think about how to label the environmental impact of food products. This is currently being experimented on the national level. The idea would be to add an eco score on the label of foodstuffs, the same way that we now have a Nutri-Score label on our products to tell them what the nutritional quality of the food is. And in this Nutri-Score, we take in consideration kinds of things. And for environmental scores, the same would apply, such as environmental impact and biodiversity. In the coming years, we will see new topics appearing, and we definitely will continue focusing on the environmental impact of the swine industry. Thank you very much for having attended this seminar. We meet again tomorrow afternoon at 1:45 for the last session regarding animal health. Have a good evening and see you tomorrow. And I hope you will all be able to go home if you need to before the curfew at 6 o'clock. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Goodbye. See you all tomorrow for the health session.
Bon, ben voilà.